receive anything. I don't know where they put these. So are we sitting, we're sitting together, we're sitting across? Ganging up. Yeah, I know. I'm the only one?
No, Chad will be here.
It's you and Chad against the world.
There's Chad, I'm glad Chad's here.
You and Chad against the world.
Which side is gonna win?
Good afternoon. We do have quorum and the time is now 3:02, so I'd like to call this meeting of the Transit Area Rating Review Subcommittee to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also be audibly and/or visually recording this meeting. Also, a friendly reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings. Our first order of business is the appointment of a chair and vice chair for 2020. May I have nominations for chair, please? So moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Partridge, to nominate Councillor Whitehead as chair of the Transit Area Rating Review Subcommittee for 2020. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, I'll proceed to an electronic vote. Correct. This is for the position of chair. And that carries. Thank you. May I have nominations for vice chair? So moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Ferguson, to nominate Councillor Pauls for the position of Vice Chair of the Transit Area Rating Review Subcommittee for 2020. Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, we'll proceed with an electronic vote. And that carries. I'd now ask Councillor Whitehead to proceed to the dais and assume the role of chair.
Well, I want to thank my nominator and the committee for entrusting me with this responsibility. I won't let you down. And that's including Councillor Lloyd Ferguson, my favorite councillor. At this point, Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there is a change to the agenda. We have an added delegation request, item 6.1, from Ian Borsick from Environment Hamilton, respecting the elimination of area rating for transit in the City of Hamilton, and that is for today's meeting.
May I have a mover and a second to approve the agenda as presented? Moved by Councillor Pauls, second by Councillor Partridge. All those in favor? Carried. Is that an electronic vote, Madam? Yeah, that's what I thought. That carries. Declaration of interest. Seeing none, I know we're all interested. We have communications 5.1 from Lakewood Beach Community Council respecting Transcab area rating. Recommendation is to be received. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Lloyd Ferguson. All those in favor? Yes, to receive, so that's not electronic. All those in favor? Carried? No, any objectors? Seeing none. Correspond, okay, we did that. So 6 delegation requests. We have Ian Borsick, Environment Hamilton, respecting the elimination of area rating for transit in the City of Hamilton for today's meeting. May I please have a motion, a mover and a seconder to approve the delegation request for today's meeting. I think it was just approve it. The request, yeah. Moved by Councillor Clark, or Chad Collins, and second by Councillor Esther Pauls. That carries. Consent items, 7.1, transit service levels, demand growth, opportunities by ward. Is there any questions respecting 7.1? Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I noticed that the last page of the report is 216 data. We don't have anything more recent in terms of the commuting within Hamilton and commuting by transit numbers, and nothing more recent than 216 in terms of our own information that we may have beyond census data.
So through the chair, to the councillor, that is the most recent information that we have is the 2016 census data.
And we wouldn't have anything through you, Mr. or Madam Chairman, then, in terms of our own transit numbers and usage and things like that? We would have numbers in terms of routes and passenger numbers and boardings, but we wouldn't have anything related to percentages as it relates to who and what area of the city are using transit?
Through the chair, we do have our own APC numbers, so you can see on pages 2 and 3 of the report, that is 2018. Sorry, on page 2 of the report, that's 2018 boardings by ward. We do have 2019 now as well, but in terms of percentage of travel between specific wards or outside of the city using transit, we rely on the census data for that.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Judy Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And similarly, on the page 404 of 7.1, the projected or forecasted increase in jobs from 2011 to 2031 for Flamborough, it's got 3,011, and we're going to be at that increase as of next year. Just as an example, we've got L3, which is 1,400 jobs. We've got Liberty, which is about 250 jobs. I'm talking about additional jobs. Stryker, we're going to have at least 75 additional jobs to the 300 that are there now, and I'm not even sure the Stryker jobs would have been captured in the 2016. We've got WPE, which is 38 jobs, and we've got Burlington Automation, which is, all these are expanding businesses. These are big businesses. And we've also got Panattoni coming in, and I mean, those ones I've just rhymed off, they're well over 3,000 just in those. So the projected amount, going up to 2031, that is way, way, way off. Just wanted to point that out. When is the next consensus data that we're going to be getting these particular job forecast numbers from? Or where does the data come from, actually?
Through the chair, on those projections, they came from the grids, the original grids projections. That's the information we had available to us at the time that this report was written. So new forecasts would be coming out of the grids 2 process, and I don't have a date on when that's completed. That's not driven through our division.
Okay, but, I mean, just Chair, through you, grids 2 is not going to be done for a few years. So we're already past that 3,000 spot now. And will the next grids numbers be from 2016 forward? Because these are 2016 to 2031. So what are the next ones going to be, 2031 and forward? Because they'll be totally missed.
Through the chair, again, when we produced this chart, it was strictly based on information that we were able to gather from our economic development and planning divisions. I would have to get back to you on when grids 2 will be completed and what the date ranges would be, but we produced this strictly on what we had available to us as provided by the economic development and planning division.
And I thank you for that answer, but I mean, I will challenge these numbers. I think they're terribly flawed, terribly flawed. If you're getting your numbers from the grids process, that is not reflective of, I mean, they're projected figures, but they're certainly not reflective of what is actually happening. And I'm not just in Flamborough, but I would say right across the city. There's other areas as well. So I really challenge where these numbers are even coming from, because they're certainly not accurate. Thank you.
And just for clarification, I believe it was GTHA mayors had a meeting, and I participated in that meeting, and they had indicated that a lot of the employment forecasts for the GTHA was so far off that it's not even reliable. And in fact, it was punishing municipalities because when they build bill form to meet those targets, and those targets aren't being reached and they're well under, they have to recapture those dollars that they're spending. So I just want to highlight that this is a greater issue than just in Hamilton. So those comments are very prudent, and I'm very supportive of them. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, thank you. Just a few questions. On page 2, that chart tells me, and I just want to confirm this, that 95% of the ridership on the HSR comes from wards 1 through 8. Have I interpreted that correctly?
Through the chair, what that tells you is that 94.5% of the boardings in 2018 were happening within the
The old
ward-
city Hamilton,
wards 1 through 8 plus 14.
those same things. So the answer is yes. Okay, and what's the second one? Is that the percentage of taxes within the bus area, or I'm not sure what that number, this chart tells us.
So through the chair, the chart on page 3 of 4 speaks to the apportionment of the tax burden, and the tax burden is based on kilometers of service by former municipality. So again, different than the previous table. Again, so what it identifies is 82%, just short of 83% of the cost of transit is borne by property owners in the former city of Hamilton. And if you work down the table, that represents the balance of the distribution or apportionment of the cost of transit.
So wards 1 through 8 are getting 95% of the riders, but paying 82% of the cost then?
Through the chair, that's correct, but the cost is apportioned according to the kilometers of service by former municipality, not by boardings.
Yeah, correct, okay. And on the page 4, when was this grids done through you, if I can, to Jason? The ones that you're using, is it quite old?
Through the chair, I believe it was completed in 2011.
And it was the same grids forecast that was used to put together the 10-year strategy?
Through the chair, I assume that is correct. I was not involved with putting together the 10-year strategy, so I'm not sure. I would assume that that's what the staff at the time had used to include in that.
Because we've fallen far short of that grids forecast, the last grids forecast. Because same thing with the numbers. I think I had well over 388 new residents move in this year, but if that was the forecast, so that's a forecast that's now 9 years old. So it doesn't really mean a lot then, because we were going through exponential growth back then, that whole Meadowlands coming on stream. It just looks, I mean, the jobs look okay at 975, but the population increase of 388 doesn't look right. Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Clark.
So, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at page 4 the chart that's dealing with commuting mode, population, employment by ward, et cetera, and I'm trying to understand what this chart is supposed to tell us, because it's based on the 2016 census data by people who indicate that they're commuting, and this is their mode of choice.
Through the chair, that is correct. It's based on census data and what individual respondents are indicating as their mode of choice, yes.
But don't we have real data?
Through the chair, I'm not sure what the question is. We have our own APC data for transit use. Are you asking
So,
if?
yeah, I'm asking why aren't we using our own data, actual data, in terms of the people who are actually commuting or using transit versus what they're saying they're using on a census?
To be honest, through the chair, I don't understand the question.
Do we not have counters on the buses now?
Through the chair, that's correct, and that's what is shown
Will that
on
not give us
page,
an accurate reflection of who's riding them?
on page 2. That shows where boardings are taking place throughout the city. and it's specific to transit only. Where people are getting on transit in 2018 by ward.
And so then what's the purpose of the census data for commuting if we actually have real data as to when they're getting on the bus or when they're not getting on the bus?
So through the chair, the census data shows where people are indicating that A, are they using transit as their commuting choice? And B, where they're commuting to. So are they commuting within Hamilton or are they leaving Hamilton?
Okay, so I guess I'm trying to understand, when I'm looking at the data, I'd like to know exactly how many people are using transit and are commuting versus saying they're commuting and saying they're using transit, because there is a difference.
So our APC, through the chair, our APCs do not query each individual customer getting on as to whether they're commuting or not commuting. It's simply a virtual turnstile that tells me a specific location in the city that somebody is getting off, or sorry, getting on the bus, and then conversely, it shows me where somebody is getting off within the city. It's not aligned to a specific individual to say this person is getting on in Ward 9 and they are getting off in Ward 1. It counts based on GPS location where somebody gets on and where somebody gets off. It doesn't get to that granular level that you're asking about.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the correlation.
Thank you. Can I ask Councillor Esther-Paul to take the chair? Yes. I'll just punch you in. Yeah, I mean, I have trouble because the problem with data is you can select the data you choose to show, but it doesn't show everything you need to know. And I've said this before, and you know, LRT was a good example of selectiveness and cherry picking of information to justify a means or an end. I'm not suggesting that's happening here by any stretch of the imagination. I want to be clear, but I think it did happen in the LRT file. But what I'm trying to understand is the service levels are so much different between the lower city and the mountain. And yet the mountain has been paying the same fee for services they haven't been receiving as the lower city for years. So per capita. So help me understand how is that captured if we're really going to have a robust conversation around this table about elimination of area rating, which we know doesn't generate one new cent, generation of the area rating on transit, that doesn't raise one new dollar in the running of the operation. I'm trying to understand, do we have fairness now in the context of the fact that for 15 years I represented the Ward 8 area. I'm trying to see how this is captured. The service level from 15 minutes and 45-minute services and so forth, from a Sunday service, those kinds of things didn't exist for a majority of the time I was a councillor. It does now because we've been fighting for it. But we've been paying for that same level of service that the lower city's already receiving. So how do I distinguish the different levels of service per capita that is taking place in the city of Hamilton? How do these charts don't bring that out. What would I need to look at so that we have a clear understanding the stark contrast in levels of services from one geographic area to another?
Yeah. So through the chair, that may be part of the presentation, Debbie's presentation, but I would suggest in part the methodology, the kilometers does capture the intervals and frequency. So if you have higher intervals and higher frequency, that would be represented in more kilometers of service by former municipality. So that methodology, in part, the use of kilometers of service, does in part capture the intervals and frequency.
So I guess the challenge I have with that, and I anticipated that being the answer, is that I have, in Ward 8, when I represent Ward 8, I think it's over 200 kilometers of roadway, where Ward 1 had 100. So when you start using kilometers of the measurement to help me understand the level of service, it gets a bit confusing when you have double the kilometers to start with in that comparison. So I don't know if kilometers is the right way to help me understand the level of service that's happening in Ward 1, say, or Ward 2 versus Ward 8, and so forth. So really, what I'm trying to ascertain, and I know you're using the kilometer thing, and I appreciate that, but there's got to be a different standard when you understand that there's so many more kilometers on the mountain. Doesn't mean that we're getting a better level of service. It just means we have more kilometers, right? So if you have double the service in Main Street, or triple the service in Main Street, and then on Mohawk, because it's much longer, hypothetically, you have just one for every 3 trips on Main Street, but because the kilometers are equal, you now can't determine whether or not you're getting the same level of service because you're using kilometers as a measurement.
So through the chair, I apologize, I wasn't clear. It might be contributing to the confusion. It's not kilometers of roadway, it's kilometers of service. So again, what we look at is, I apologize, I wasn't clear in my response. So we look at the actual kilometers of service by former municipality. So if it were a route with 15-minute intervals or frequency, that would be captured in the kilometers of service versus a route that had hour frequency or intervals. And so the more frequent the service, the more kilometers of service. And that was my reference to how I think it's a proxy as it relates to capturing level of service is the kilometer.
So can I suggest, and I understand, appreciate it, I really thank you for, I think you might have been clear in the first time, but I just didn't capture the service piece, so I don't think you made the mistake I think I did. But what I would like to know is if there's a better way to demonstrate then, because I don't like that model in demonstrating the service level. I want a model that my constituents can understand. So I want to know and understand the differential in levels of services and not fold it into sort of a large macro kilometer service, because what's that include? Does that include level, does that frequency, does that include weekends, does that include, people don't know that difference by just that generic term. So is there a way that we can chart this that is more understandable by our constituents in regards to the level of services that are being provided geographically in our city?
So through the chair, we certainly could break it out through level of frequency of service through the different time periods of the day. So in the AM rush hour, how frequent are the buses, off-peak, and then early evenings, and Saturdays and Sundays. We certainly can display it that way, and then that way residents would know how frequently the buses are running on the.
That's excellent. I think it's just more understandable and more it lays it out a little clearer, so we're having an informed conversation that we can make those clear distinctions in those conversations. The last question I have is, when I look at the charts, and I know Councillor Collins has the same issues, so now we represent a ward that has a combined geographic area, right? So when I look at the chart, they're saying 82.7% in Ward 14 in the taxes. But I'm trying to understand the portion of the ward that is only paying for the kilometer service. How is that integrated in this chart?
So through the chair, I apologize. I may not understand the question. If the question is, does the chart on page 3, how does it compare to the chart on page 2 as relates to boardings versus kilometers?
Yeah, I'm trying to, because there's no stars, there's no, normally on a chart you would make the distinction that here's the combined ward, so this would either exclude or include what is happening in the Ancaster side of the 14 versus the old Ward 8 numbers, and I don't see the distinction between. It looks like they're folding both numbers into one.
So through the chair, that's correct. So the tax rate in Hamilton is different than the transit tax rate in former City of Hamilton properties is different than the tax rates in the outlying municipalities, and it's part of our presentation. But as it relates to a ward that has a mix of former City of Hamilton versus former Town of Ancaster, so that's not captured in that, but we can provide you the different tax rates. It is part of my presentation, but we can provide a bit more of a descriptor. So
I appreciate
again,
it.
there are hybrids.
I appreciate that. I just found it a little confusing looking at the charts, knowing that there is a nuance that isn't being captured on these charts that I was hoped that we at least cover at some point. So thank you very much for the answers, and Mike, you didn't make the mistake I did. You were clear, that was services. And I take the chair back.
Okay, I think, do you want to speak to the side?
Yeah, through the chair, I was just going to say, we could clean that chart up for you, and we could add you know, your ward number into the Ancaster as Ward 12 and 14. The actual breakdown is specific to former municipality, or former Hamilton versus former municipality. So the numbers are accurate. We can add the additional line items to say that there is apportionment of your ward in the Ancaster bucket, and likewise an apportionment of Ward 5 in the Stony Creek bucket as well.
Perfect. That's all I asked for. It's just so we have absolute clarity and we're speaking the same language. Thank you. Take the chair back.
Take the chair.
And I have Councillor Ferguson.
Just to supplement your questions, I'm beginning to better understand the charts on page 2 and page 3. So just for clarity, Ancaster has 1.5% of the ridership on page 2, but is paying 4.3% of the cost. Have I got that right?
Through the chair, that's correct.
And the Old City Hamilton wards 1 through 8 is paying 94.5% of the cost, but has got 82.7% of the ridership.
That's
Or the other way around, I'm sorry. 94.5% of the ridership and paying 82.7% of the cost.
correct. And I will add that this is the post-revenue portion. This is the tax levy. And so what is not incorporated in this and what we don't have the information is where the revenues are being generated from. So if fewer people are using the service in the former municipalities and paying to get onto the service, they also may be paying a fraction of what those in Hamilton proper are in terms of what goes into the fare box.
But it only measures when you get on, not when you get off then.
Correct.
But wouldn't it repeat itself at night? So it should balance off, shouldn't it? You're going in the morning, coming home at night?
Provided that you're going all the way across into those former municipalities, yes.
Yeah, well, if you're going in, you're probably coming out.
Through the chair, that may be accurate, it may not be.
Okay. I think I better understand this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Ferguson. So at this point, I need the report to be received. There's no more further questions? Okay, did you, Esther, sorry?
I don't understand, it says on page 4 of 4, presenting commuting within Hamilton. So they're not using transit. What kind of transit? Are they driving cars, or how are they communicating? What's the difference?
Through the chair, in that chart, the first column is showing the percentage of people who have identified through the census that they are commuting within Hamilton.
Right.
The second column shows the percentage of those who've identified as commuting, who are commuting by transit.
Okay.
That's their mode of choice.
So do you think that's kind of low? From 76%, we only have Ward 7 I'm looking at. There's 47,000 people, and 13% are using transit?
I would say 13% is high when our mode split target is 12% citywide. So Ward 7 is slightly above that. So you can see a variation depending on wards what the mode of choice is.
Well, if you look at Ward 2, 24%, that's high, but as I look at 47,000 people, 13%, Ward 7. So you said usually it's 12%, that's high? That's the base? Is that what you're saying?
Through the chair, 12% is our mode target in our transportation master plan.
It is, eh? Okay, I just wanted to see the difference. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and I don't know if it's anticipated in the presentations. Do we have the breakdown of kilometer cost to provide public transit?
So through the chair, I don't recall seeing that content in the presentation, but again, that could be a follow-up that
I think it's
we
it's an easy measurement to apply when we're having those conversations. So kilometer cost for public transit in the city of Hamilton. Appreciate that.
So through the chair, we could look at gross and net, the gross and net costs.
Yep. Okay, I need a mover to receive 7.1. Moved by Councillor Clark, second by Councillor Partridge. All those in favor? Carried. Now, I believe we're at the delegation. Yep. Ian Borsak, Environment Hamilton, respecting the elimination of area rating for transit in the city of Hamilton. I would like to call on Ian, Environment Hamilton, to delegate respecting the elimination of area rating for transit in the city of Hamilton. Please come down, which he is. He's well prepared, he's well experienced, and welcome.
Thank you, Councillor. And thank you, committee, for meeting and having me today, and thank you, staff, for being here, and everyone else as well. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to make it very clear that I'm presenting on behalf of the Hamilton Transit Alliance. I'm going to be showing the membership on the screen as well. In terms of after my presentation, if there's any further questions, I'll be able to answer as best I can on behalf of the Hamilton Transit Alliance, but I want to make it very clear when I'm talking on behalf of the other members and when I'm talking on behalf of Environment Hamilton, so I just wanted to flag that for everyone. So firstly, the Hamilton Transit Alliance is a coalition of local stakeholder organizations within the city of Hamilton. We've all convened for almost 2 years now. It was March of 2 years ago that we first had our initial meeting. And we've been meeting as stakeholder organizations to have conversations about public transit based around our core shared values of wanting to see public transit enhanced and improved within the city of Hamilton. Within the importance of eliminating area rating, specifically these are the 12-member organizations that reached an agreement on what I'm going to be presenting to all of you today. And that is ATU 107, Hamilton Acorn, Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion, the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, Hamilton District Labour Council, the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, which is very active here in Hamilton, as I'm sure you're all aware, Environment Hamilton, obviously, the YWCA Hamilton, McMaster Student Union, Social Planning Research Council, the Immigrant Workers Center, and Neighbor to Neighbor. You don't have to read all this. This is the letter that we sent out to council regarding our budget recommendations for the 2020 budget, and I've highlighted the relevant information there that I've broken down into more easily digestible text for you all right here. And so very specifically, I want to flag that we as the Hamilton Transit Alliance fully recognize that area rating for transit and area rating generally for other services in the past is a political problem that is going to have an imperfect solution. Not everyone's going to be happy with everything. And as we've also learned just from asking staff of the questions regarding the information that we're being presented, there's a lot more information that we need to be seeing. So, I ultimately do fully support Councillor Clark's motion to extend the terms of reference for this subcommittee. I think further discussion would be really great. But really, ultimately, we agreed on 3 key end goals for the elimination of area rating within the city of Hamilton, which is that it should be gradually implemented. There shouldn't be an immediate change that's made. There was no specific time frame that we would recommend, but maybe a term of council, maybe 5 years would something be acceptable for both residents and for council to adjust to. We want to see it lead to ultimately to expand and improve service for the HSR for all urban and suburban residents. I'm going to flag very specifically that we say urban and suburban, not rural, and I want to make that distinction very clear. And then ultimately, we want to see the elimination of area rating lead to an increase in money that leads to the HSR. More specifically within the presentation that's going to be coming forward from staff after this, within the 3 options that are being presented, I don't believe any of these 3 options accomplish our 3 main goals. Anecdotally, we haven't done a survey, but I can tell you, working at Environment Hamilton for the last few years talking about this issue, no one within the old city of Hamilton has told me that they want their taxes to go down or they want their levy to go down in what is attributed to transit. That isn't a scientific claim, but anecdotally, no one within the Hamilton Transit Alliance wants to see the old city of Hamilton pay less into what is currently being paid into transit. Ultimately, that's our key main 3 focuses. As I said before, we fully recognize that this is a complicated situation. We fully recognize that making a recommendation for the 2020 budget is just not feasible, so we fully support Councillor Clark's motion to extend the terms of reference to the 2021 budget. And ultimately as well, I think in terms of the last page of the slide from the staff presentation that's coming forward, this subcommittee meeting and making decisions over the course of this year that can then be in line with the HSR re-envision project, which is going to be wrapping up. And there's a great timeline at the end. I think it's the last slide of that staff presentation that's coming up. Makes a lot of sense to me, and I think going forward, seeing this subcommittee look over more information and discuss this issue and hopefully land on the ultimate conclusions that we at the Hamilton Transit Alliance would like to see accomplished is something that we're really excited for. And as well, I'm excited to answer any questions. And I know all of you will certainly be hearing from us again in the future as well. Thank you.
We're certainly not short of questioners, so I'm going to start
Okay,
with
great.
Councillor Collins, then I have Councillor Ferguson and Councillor Brad Clark. So Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and Ian, thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to get to the third point there, and I wanted to confirm with staff, because I've seen this point a couple of times on social media, and I'm not a regular participant there, but I have seen the same with certain groups, that by eliminating area rating, there'll be extra money available to invest in the transit. And I know that from our last time when we dealt with area rating, that wasn't an option when we went through this exercise 5 or 6 years ago with other area rated services. So I was hoping while Ian's at the podium, if we could have staff clarify that the issue is who pays and how much, and any savings that would accrue by changing that formula would not be eligible to be reinvested back into the system, as far as I know. I just want to confirm that while Ian's here.
It was a statement I made earlier, and I'll have Mike Zegaric respond to your question.
Yeah, through the chair, the councillor's right. So, and this will be part of staff's presentation. So
Okay,
area rating is a financing tool that reflects where there is a different level of service or a different cost of service delivery. Is some municipalities employ or leverage area rating to recognize those different service levels or different costs. It is revenue neutral to the municipality. Area rating doesn't determine the level of service, and I've heard the suggestion as well, is if there were to be a alternative approach to area rating, and if the city of Hamilton clawed back the savings to the former city of Hamilton, those dollars could be employed to increase service levels elsewhere. So I would identify that doesn't align to legislative requirements. So think of it this way, is if under one of the scenarios, if we eliminated area rating and every property owner in the city paid the same transit area, transit tax rate, that would result in a tax reduction, a shift from the former city of Hamilton to the outlying areas. If one of the outcomes were to be claw back that savings and reinvest those dollars into transit service, that doesn't align with the legislative and regulatory requirements in that your taxation reflects the level of service. So now if you're taxing former city of Hamilton and you're not at the previous rate and you're not increasing the level of service directly to the former city of Hamilton, now you're misaligned to that principle or that requirement. So the only way to do so, if the intent was to claw back those tax savings, there would have to be a corresponding increase in service level just to the former city of Hamilton. Those investments cannot be employed or directed outside of the former city of Hamilton because the tax dollars are being raised in the former city of Hamilton. I hope I've answered the question.
Thanks, Mike. And I raise it only in the context with Ian at the podium because it is a common suggestion that's been made. And I know that, Ian, you do a lot online in terms of educating the public in terms of these policies and other things that we deal with beyond just transit. So I'm hoping that that explanation and whatever forms part of Mike's presentation later can be incorporated into whatever public messaging you do in the future. That's all. Thank you.
Absolutely. If I can just respond, Mr. Zegaric did raise the point that service could be improved, and we would be supportive of that. So,
Thank you. Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand how eliminating area rating would decrease the barriers of adding transit when our main driver of our last number of budgets has been transit. This year alone, we're seeing 10%. How the heck would reducing area rating eliminate a barrier to increasing transit spending where we're 5 times the rate of inflation already?
So to my understanding and to our understanding, when you are having a service level that crosses that barrier of what the old municipality of Hamilton and, let's say, Ancaster was, the way that service is delivered is changed and the way that service is paid for is changed. So we see that as a barrier to both planning and expansion. Public Works Manager Dan McKinnon did clearly state on a CBC live interview a few years ago that it's a political barrier to expanding transit to other old municipalities. And ultimately, we should be viewing all suburban and urban areas as one city, not within the context of Flamborough, Ancaster, Dundas, but rather we should be looking at where are there density that could abide by transit, and we should be delivering transit to those areas.
Okay, I didn't quite understand that answer, but are you not happy with the progress we've made in our 10-year transit strategy?
I'm not claiming that at all, Councillor.
You're what?
I'm not claiming that at all, Councillor.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer. You're not what?
I'm not claiming that I'm unhappy or that we're unhappy with the progress that's been made at all.
But you want more. You see, it'll result in increased funding for HSR, so you're not happy with the amount that we're increasing funding already on HSR.
So in light of the climate emergency that was unanimously declared by the City Council and understanding that transportation emissions are the highest source of transit emissions, of emissions within the City of Hamilton, as under control by the City Council, that is within the municipality, that is removing industry that we don't have control over, we firmly believe that we should be continuously progressing and seeking to do better. And that is my role as a transit advocate to push on.
But you're assuming that when you add transit.
Sorry, Councillor Ferguson, I just remind you to ask the question through the chair, so we don't get into a direct debate.
Yeah, but everybody yells at me because I don't speak in.
That's fine.
I'm trying to get over to the mic as much as I can. You know? So you're assuming.
Good question.
That if you put more transit on, you're going to get more riders, because surely you would even agree that an empty bus is putting out fumes also.
Yes, but at the same time, I know that we don't get that ridership without the service in the first place.
Okay, but if the buses in suburban areas are running empty now, what are you going to accomplish by adding more buses?
I would be looking at reliability of service. I'd be looking at when those buses have come. I would also be looking at where those buses are going as well. This is what the purpose of the re-envision process has been, in my opinion, from what I've seen, in that we have buses and bus routes that, yeah, I do completely agree with you in your points that you were making in committee this week, just yesterday, in that, yes, there are some bus routes that probably aren't efficient. But at the same time...
So should we eliminate those then?
I believe that we should be looking at, rather than talking about eliminating bus routes, we should be looking at redistributing bus routes, if that is the issue.
Okay, because by adding more buses, you're putting more carbon in the air, and if the buses aren't being ridden, it's not helping that situation.
Councillor, I would ask you to not assume that we're advocating for just simply increasing service for the sake of it, but rather relying on HSR staff with increased resources to be able to expand service in a way that will increase ridership.
But you're suggesting, and all those agencies that you put down there, I really suspect you don't understand what area rating is. I hope you learned something with Mike's explanation there. But by taking up taxes exponentially in suburban areas that don't really use the buses is going to increase funding for HSR. And it probably will, because it has to be spent in the old city. But you want to dump that cost back in the suburbs. We just saw in a report that 95% of the users are from wards 1 through 8, but they're only paying 84% of the cost. The rest is being paid by the suburbs. And yet you want to make that worse by eliminating area rating.
I disagree with your analysis of
What
what I'm
part do you
saying
disagree
right
with?
now. I also disagree with your analysis of what staff responded to as well. I believe that ultimately what we have to do is we have to focus in on contributing resources to an vitally important public service that can help us accomplish what we need to do as a community within the City of Hamilton. and increasing resources certainly helps to do that. But also a project like the Re-Envision project, which is looking at taking feedback from residents from all across the city and looking at where we can be putting services and where we can be putting both new routes and eliminating old routes, is also incredibly important. And it's part of a larger pie, if you want to say, sir, in that we see this not as a panacea. This is not a solution. This is not the one silver bullet, but it's rather part of a long-term process in which that we can help, hopefully, achieve the vision that is being laid out in the 10-year transit strategy, that we can hopefully achieve the ridership that's necessary, that we can encourage the ridership that's necessary to see the blast network fulfilled in the future. And that's what we all agree on, and we see that value in that. I don't see us as coming forward to you to simply ask for suburban residents to pay for a service that they don't want. Whether someone rides the bus.
That's what it does. You just heard that explanation, although you disagreed with that, which I don't understand. I mean, you can't stand up there and say these motherhood statements without backing it up with the facts. We're not touching re-envisioning today. It's coming. We're looking forward to it in June.
It was
But
referenced
you're
in
suggesting that we eliminate area rating, which is dump more costs onto suburbs and have it all invested back in the old city. And I just ask you, where's the fairness of that, particularly when there's not a big usage in the suburban areas? And secondly, that the previous report clearly demonstrates that suburban municipalities are paying, a disproportionate amount of cost already for transit based on usage, where 95% of the usage is from wards 1 through 8, but they're only paying for 84%. The suburbs are paying for the balance. So there's already an imbalance in there.
So,
I don't know how you don't agree with that.
I know I do agree that area rating has led to suburban areas paying more for the service that they get. And I fully recognize that as well. But I think at the same time, you also have to understand, Councillor, that people benefit from transit whether they're using it or not themselves. So you driving from Ancaster to City Hall, you benefit from people deciding not to drive their cars as well, be that within the emissions that are generated from that and the impact it has on the carbon in our atmosphere, immediate air quality, having those roads be cleared up for you in your vehicle. So there's a lot of other benefits to public transit beyond just who is using the service immediately as a service user.
Okay, I've made my point, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
I'm still not clear how buses running empty is better for the environment and better for the people who are driving in. But I've made my point.
Thank you. Councillor Brad Clark.
Good afternoon, Ian. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Councillor.
So, Mr. Chairman, I thought I heard Ian say that the elimination of area rating would increase resources. Did I hear that correctly, or did I mishear that?
We specifically, I want to say, we believe that the elimination of area rating ought to increase the resources for transit. I also want to just fully admit that when I said at the very beginning of this that this is a political issue and that we understand that this is a messy issue as well, that I'm just bringing forward what we ought to see as the end result of this elimination of area rating that we see as a political barrier to the expansion and improvement of transit. I'm not claiming that it will. It very well could not. There's a lot of, you have three options up before you right now as well that all have very different end results. I'm just simply making a recommendation based off of what we ought to see.
So is it fair to say that the vision, if you will, of the Hamilton Transit Alliance is to see more resources go into transit? That would be the high-end vision, correct?
And ultimately be able to eliminate barriers that make expansion into the urban and suburban areas that have inadequate service much less burdensome.
Okay, I understand that. The challenge that we're experiencing is more of a legislative one rather than a philosophical one, because area rating is really a tax policy. It shifts taxation. It doesn't create new resources. So for example, the way the legislation is currently written is that changes to area rating, and we're allowed to do it as a municipality, you're 100% correct, and we could go to the rural-urban split, which has been touted by many as a potential change. What that would do is shift taxes from some residents to others, but not create more revenue. Do we agree on that?
Unless service is reflecting of that, of the taxation being brought, right?
The service component has to be separate from the area rating. We can deal with area rating, then we would address service.
And I think that would be completely adequate in our mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and therein lies some of the challenges when, for example, and I'm just going to use, Mr. Chairman, if I may, parochially, Ward 9. So when I look at page 2 of 4, it says the distribution of annual boardings by ward is 1.25%. So that's the current number for the people who are using transit in Ward 9. If we were to shift, change our area rating to general revenue, so everyone is on the same level playing field for taxation, that would increase the taxes in Stony Creek by $250, but it doesn't change the amount of service, and it doesn't change the amount of ridership. It just means they're paying more. And then similarly, if we went to a 50-50 split, it's $128 more per household. Doesn't change the number of boardings, doesn't change the number of service. And then we don't have a rural urban. We might get that later today. We don't have that yet. So I think that's where the challenge is where someone has made a statement, area rating is a political barrier to expansion and improvements. Philosophically, that's probably an accurate statement. But we're only allowed to modify area rating in certain ways under the legislation. And so if we went to a rural split, you're still going to have Ward 9 paying dramatically more. Other wards may pay less, but the actual revenue to HSR does not change. After we do that, then we have to now put our mindset to increase resources, and how do we deal with that accordingly. So we're all on the same page?
Yeah.
Okay. And so then your suggestion is a gradual implementation of the shifting in the area rating, so that I'm assuming you're talking about, in essence, phasing it in over a period of time.
Yes.
So 10 years, a certain percentage per year, or whatever the case is.
Discussions around the table never went as long as 10 years, I just wanted to say, but yes.
Okay, but that's what your suggestion is.
Yes.
And then your hope is that if we can come to a conclusion on that, then we can start to put our mind to how do we improve the resources for transit. Is that a fair summation of where you are as a group or yourself?
Councillor Clark, I think you've done a very good job summarizing our position, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you coming today.
Yeah.
Then can I ask Councillor Esther-Paul to take the chair? Ian, council needs to be pressed. We need to hold our feet to the fire, and organizations like you and others are really appreciated for coming. Doesn't mean we have to agree, but this is where I believe the fantasy social media this is where the rubber hits a transit road. Because there's so many misunderstandings and ignorance out in the social media world on transit, it's embarrassing. And now we can clarify those whether it's the ideology or whatever. So I'm going to put it to you, I'm going to approach this from a different form, because the outlying areas, God bless them, were forced into a marriage with the city in I believe it was 2001. And so they wouldn't be part and harmonized into that macro transit policy at the time. Maybe they should have, but it wasn't done. But as I observe representing Ward 8, which was 58,000 population for 15 years, and took a look at the level of taxation that my residents were paying for transit, but the level of service they received, it's not all that comforting. So when I look at 20 years, 30 years that there's such a stark contrast in service levels between the lower city and the mountain, yet we were paying the same fee, but we weren't getting any benefit, nor were we getting the changes in service levels. How do you justify that to your taxpayers you represent, that holistically, I believe transit is a very important element in your city. We should all be paying the same for that transit system and eventually gets to you, but what is the timeline? And in the mountains case, it's been over 30 years. 30 years. We haven't caught up with the lower city yet. So how can you keep going back to your taxpayer and say, you'll never regain this? This might be a good public policy, but at the end of the day, you're not getting the benefit, your children are not going to get the benefit, and you're lucky if your grandchildren get the benefit, because that's where we're at. So I can understand why the outlying areas would have some concern, that now they're going to be roped into an area rating situation where they're not going to see that higher level of service for 20, 30 years. What's your response to that?
I have that same concern, Councillor, and ultimately at the end of the day, we at the Hamilton Transit Alliance and myself as representative of Environment Hamilton, yeah, the mountain needs better transit service. That's just quite frank, and I agree with you on that. Ultimately, my personal concern is without the elimination of area rating, the chances of increasing service is even lower. And so I believe, yes, you raised some really great points regarding transit service on the mountain, and I completely agree with you. But I don't think the appropriate solution to that is to then reduce the tax base that's going towards that service on the mountain. I think that the appropriate response on that is to be continuing with the re-envision process, looking at where we have services that are inadequate and looking at bringing those services up to par. In that we believe, as I said, all urban and suburban residents should have adequate service.
And I appreciate, I know you're being sincere, but I guess my point is, how does the outlying area that sees the experience of the mountain, who were entrapped into this visionary public good policy, at least it seemed to be that, and yet it turns out that they have paid triple, quadruple the amount of taxes, voluminous, in regards to the public transit system, but never, ever received the benefit of the same level of service as another geographic area in the city. How is that fair, and how is that sustainable, and how would they, the outlying areas, looking at what happened, say, hey, this is a great idea?
I would simply just then reiterate that as my position at Environment Hamilton and through the Hamilton Transit Alliance, we would continue to advocate for the City Council of Hamilton to prioritize staff and direct staff to look at reprioritization of routes so that way service levels are adequate everywhere.
I appreciate it. I remember working with Brian McCaddy, and there was provincial funding from the gas tax for operating, and I think there was 3 projects identified in that. One went to the mountain in Rymel, and that was just to put the first, and I was fighting for that additional. I had a fight for that transit route, but 2 of them went downtown, yet again. The resident on the mountain looking for a higher level of service when you have an A service in the lower city and a D service on the mountain are shaking their heads and say, look, we're paying the same level of taxes, aren't we? How come we're not getting the same benefit? So I guess there's real issues, political, that come into play. I understand the philosophy, and I always believe in the philosophy, but when I look back at what has happened to mountain residents and the amount of money they invested over the years that the lower city didn't have to because they got the level of service much quicker, I'm trying to understand the equity. I'm trying to understand how the mountain residents who paid millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars over the last number of decades were treated fair on the public transit file. And I don't see it, and I can see why the outlying area are a little resident to do it. I guess my last question, because I want to reaffirm it to those fantasy goers on social media, is that the taxing policy when it comes to area rating, and it doesn't matter what it is revenue neutral. There is no gain in taxes into the system. And I think that was the original piece of ignorance, is people automatically say, you do that, oh wow, you could have all this new money coming into the system. There's no new money, because what ends up happening is a balancing. So if Ancaster comes in and your budget is $1.5 billion to provide the service, then you can't go over that $1.5 billion to provide the service on the taxation, your fares, your X, and so forth. But at the end of the day, the amount of revenue you can bring in is the same. So if you're bringing Ancaster in and asking them to pay their full pop now, you can't generate more than what the system is operating at the time. So that means that basically if you can't generate any more money, then basically there's a balancing act that takes place, and the balance of the city would actually see their taxes actually slightly go down to make up the differential that comes in, but there's no new money. You appreciate that at this point?
No, and I want to be very clear that I believe Councillor Clark got to our key point, which is we understand that what we're presenting here isn't entirely under the control of this subcommittee, but rather this subcommittee is going to be making a recommendation to the rest of council that council then can move forward with. And we would really like to see this subcommittee see our philosophical principles that we brought forward and have that understood by the rest of council
bless
what
you.
the point of this is.
So I want to make it clear that I bought into the overall policy at first, because I see transit as the blood, the basic of the veins, or the important element to meet needs of the broader community, and that's how I always seen it. But as a person understands taxation and over the years understand the pressure and the impacts of residents and really tough decisions being made in households, it's becoming abundantly more clear to me that we don't have that kind of capacity in the community to, because the landscape isn't staying still. So when we talk about these increases, that's an absence of understanding what is happening during annualized budgets when the province is downloading issues and we're taking on greater cost, and we got to impose that on the taxpayers, and there's a breaking point, and we have a lot of seniors in this community, and so I'm always conscious of the impact of residents. So you made a comment that you didn't see anyone saying, hey, let's lower what the mountain pays for taxes. It's not about lowering for transit, but what it is about not having increased. And this helps the balance of those issues in regards to the needs to the overall budget to lower the impact of increases than it is part of the comprehensive approach to taxation. So you can't isolate that on itself. You got to build it into the overall taxation, comprehensive taxation policies of the City of Hamilton. So I want to highlight that because you did make that comment. And I really appreciate it. But look, I don't want to discourage you. I think that you need to keep holding your feet to fire, and I think we need to put more money into public transit. Those two principles, I'm absolutely with you, and I want to thank you for coming forward.
Yeah, and just to clarify again, we fully understand that this is not a fun situation to talk about. This is something that is, a 21 or 19-year problem that has been building over time. Yeah. And so that's why I wanted to really flag that we understand that this is a political situation that the rest of this subcommittee have to take into account, but then also your recommendations have to be considered by the rest of council. So I wanted to provide this, ultimate vision of what we see for transit and how it relates to the elimination of area rating. And hopefully the members of this subcommittee and the rest of council agree with us on that. But that is all I can bring forward. I completely understand that there's other considerations in place, but I'm hoping that our membership in that we've brought forward this vision and we've brought forward to you will be considered heavily as this subcommittee continues to meet and discuss how we can eliminate the barrier to transit expansion.
I think the bigger picture for your organization, I think you would agree. Let's put more investment in public transit, period. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor.
I would take the chair back. Have no one else? Esther?
This is all new to me. You agreed with Councillor Clark and Councillor Whitehead that eliminating area rating does not increase funding. We know that. It does not lead to improvement. So how does it improve the HSR? Can you name me, how does that improve?
So
Whether we do it or not, I don't understand how would it improve the HSR?
So right now we have areas of the city that are area rated for transit.
Right.
So expansion into those areas is more difficult in that you have to factor in how that's going to be taxing those individual communities. And as Councillor Clark clarified, we very much see the elimination of area rating a first step or one of the many steps that are being taken that can then help achieve the wider vision that we see for the city of Hamilton. But in no way do we see the elimination of area rating as the silver bullet. As I said, it's not the one thing that will do it. And I want to make that very clear, but there will be, in our view, there should be subsequent decisions made by council, not just this subcommittee, but by the entirety of council, that will help see this vision.
I still don't understand how you would get funding for HSR, even if it's, area rated, that everybody pitches in. We're still not getting extra money. So,
I think it's important to perhaps, if staff could provide an explanation of why transit into certain areas and expansion to certain areas is so difficult. The Binbrook example is a really good example of why area rating is making transit expansion so difficult, in that that was extremely costly for really bad service, and it was, and the Binbrook residents, ultimately opposed it, and it was removed as a service. And that was because of area rating.
would there be a survey, like, let's say in Ancaster, that the people do want transit, or in Waterdown, or in Binbrook? Would they be a survey that they want transit? And would that be a survey to do that? Or?
I think ultimately the Re-Envision project, I haven't combed through all the survey results, but that was, I think, an incredibly proficient survey that was done that both conveyed both transit riders and non-transit riders. And I think ultimately what that survey showed to me was that reliability and frequency is how people get on the bus. And if the reliability and frequency isn't there in the first place, they're not necessarily going to be getting on the bus. A great example that was told to me is, let's say you have a gated driveway and you have a car and you can leave whenever you want, but your gate, for whatever reason, only opens every hour and 20 minutes. That's significantly more of a hassle and significantly more of an issue for you to leave than if it were to open every 30 minutes. And area rating comes into factor for that, both with frequency of service. But ultimately what we want to be seeing is an expansion of service that's adequate across all suburban and urban residents.
Thank you.
Sorry, can you take it for one more? I meant to ask a question on the slide in front of us. And I remember attending the LRT file, and a couple councillors have I guess they have the membership of every one of these organizations. They flashed it out, and all these people showed up, and they weren't clear why, other than they needed to support each other on the LRT file. And I remember talking to a couple, I'm not going to tell you which ones, and the first question I asked each one of them is, did your membership endorse your position? And each answer was no. So they hadn't brought their positions to their membership. It was an executive or an independent people within the executive that were taking positions and working along this group, but they didn't have the endorsement to support, because McMaster Student Union, do they understand the complexities around area rating and whether there's any new money generated into the system? And the answer was no. So help me understand when you throw names up like that, because I'm tired of people, it's not just you, I want to make it clear, but organizations come forward and just freely throw names up and saying, these are the endorsers, and then everyone sort of buys into that. This whole membership's on side, when I'm finding out that's not the case.
So thank you for that clarification question, Councillor. Just to be very clear, the membership of the Hamilton Transit Alliance, each membership organization has a liaison to the Transit Alliance that attends meetings regularly that are then updated regularly. So each organization on this list has a specific individual, or in a couple of cases individuals, who attend our meetings regularly. Those individuals signed a memorandum of agreement, which was our organizational principles and our basic values. And how those individuals then report to the organizations that they represent at the table is understood to represent those organizations. So I don't know who you're talking about, but I can say quite safely that each member organization on this list has been attending meetings and weighed in on the specific issue, weighed in on very specifically on the wording that we submitted to council in our 2020 budget recommendation letter, and that was all sought. So we are a democratic organization. We typically have made decisions based on consensus. I can say Councillors Clark and Partridge might remember during the municipal election, we weren't all in agreement about this topic at the time when we met with you. But now we are, and this was the agreement that we reached on, and I just want to be very clear about what the membership of the organization is.
So the reason I'm saying that, because I represented a Silker union, and I would never be able to sit on a committee like this without having a resolution and endorsement by the membership on those issues. So I would have to take whatever you did, bring it back to the membership, get an endorsement of that position by the membership, because it would have to be debated within that organization. And then you would have a resolution that would safely be in the hands of this organization. So if that is the case, I'm asking for, by Wednesday, that's tomorrow night, right, council? Or when this goes to council, I like to see the resolution of every one of those organizations and the vote count in each of their memberships that supported this position.
That is not how we operate as an organization.
But how can they represent themselves on this committee if they don't have resolutions through the chair from their bodies?
That is not for me to decide. If the leadership of an organization has communicated that this person will be the liaison on the committee, then I have to take that as an understanding of how that organization works. A lot of organizations that are on this list don't necessarily operate on a membership basis, and some do, some don't. And I'm not comfortable to say that that can be accomplished, in that all I can say is I've done my due diligence in ensuring that all the organizations have gone through the proper leadership. There isn't, just to throw in an example, there isn't just some rogue member of ATU 107 coming to our meetings, but rather I know that the leadership of all these organizations are aware of this.
So I asked 2 organizations to produce a resolution. They say they don't have one because they never brought it to their membership. So I want to make it clear when people see these lists listed up here, it doesn't necessarily mean that they got the endorsement of their membership. And I want to be clear of that because they haven't produced that. And if they start producing it, then it gives it more credibility. The fact that it's just one person sitting at the table is taking a position and bringing it back to their executive and having a conversation doesn't mean it's being endorsed. And we need to understand that. So I want to highlight that as well for the social media group as well. Thank you. Take the chair back. Yeah, I need a motion to receive. Oh, sorry, Councillor Ferguson.
And just one more quick question, and I think you made the comment, just confirm for me if I got this correct, that you felt that elimination of area rating would be less of a political barrier to enhance transit in the suburban areas. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to let you know what I experienced during the budget process. I thought for sure the service into the Ancaster Industrial Park was a frequency of 1 per hour. I found out during the budget process it's actually every 20 minutes and going to 15 minutes. I wasn't consulted first, so how was that a barrier?
I'm not sure how to answer that question, Councillor.
Well, how did it create a barrier to enhancing service into the suburbs if the local ward council wasn't even consulted? They just did it. So I don't understand where the barrier is.
I don't know. I don't understand how to answer that question, Councillor. That's something for you to take up with staff.
I think the answer is maybe you weren't factually correct that services are in fact being enhanced in the suburban areas with no barriers, political barriers.
I did not say that service isn't being enhanced in the suburban areas.
Okay, I give up. Thanks.
Thank you. I need a motion to receive the presentation moved by Councillor Clark, second by Councillor Esther Pauls. All those in favor? All those in favor? Carried. Sorry. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'll take balance those conversations offline to better understand it. Madam Clerk, we are now at presentations. So transit, service levels, demand and growth, opportunities by ward. Referred from the General Issues Committee on February 28, 2019. Are there, okay, so we're having a presentation on this, right?
So through the chair, you have a joint presentation by Transit Services staff and Corporate Services staff. So Debbie and I will take committee through the presentation this afternoon. We'll speak to, Debbie will describe a bit of the transit 10-year strategy, some service levels. I'll provide a bit of a primer with respect to area rating in general, and then a little further into transit area rating. And you'll see the very last slide is staff's recommendations in terms of a timeline as it relates to re-envision and the work of this subcommittee. So as it relates to why we're before you, it was back in last year in March that council approve the following motion is that staff be directed to report back to the Transit Area Rating Review Subcommittee with some analysis. I won't read all of C or D. And again, we're before you with some content around transit and area rating and transit area rating. And again, we're here to receive any direction from subcommittee as it relates to any options going forward. So while we have some options for consideration, just wanting to highlight that, again, if there were further options or further direction from this subcommittee, we would incorporate that in future updates. So I'm going to pass it over to Debbie, who's going to describe, provide a bit of a primer on transit and transit service levels, and then I'll provide updates on area rating.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, committee. Just going to start off the presentation from the perspective, oops, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. Nope, I'm not. Just to talk specifically and start off around what we're doing with transit. This is information that I've been before council and committee a number of times, so it's a review. But I think it's important for this particular discussion to clearly delineate growing transit and then how we're going to fund transit are two separate conversations. So starting off with the 10-year transit strategy, the 10-year transit strategy had two goals that were in its development and then came to council for approval. One was to grow ridership, and the second goal of the 10-year transit strategy was to get us for rapid readiness. So when the plan was developed back in 2014, those were the main objectives as far as that was laid out. So it was a financial plan with some concept around how we were going to grow ridership through the years to get us to the point to be rapid ready. Also, what that was leading us to then was getting ready for the BLAST network, which is the diagram in front of you today. And to get us to BLAST through the 10 years transit strategy was the plan was at the end of the 10 years that we would have 10-minute peak service across the BLAST network with express over local. So it wasn't getting us to BRT, it was just getting us to that point to be ready for the next higher order transit across the city, and to increase our modal split, so to get people out of their cars and onto transit and using transit. Currently, approximately 35% of all our customer activity takes place in these six common activity areas. So Eastgate Square, Lime Ridge Mall, Redeemer, Mohawk College, McMaster, downtown Hamilton, McMaster University, and then the center on Barton. So these are the areas that are creating 35% of our customer activity, and these are all options or all areas of the city that are serviced by frequent transit currently. In regards to employment growth areas that are linked to the BLAST line, so the Stony Creek Business Center, which is linked to the B line, the Ancaster Business Park, which is the S line, the Airport Employment Growth District, which is the A line, and the Red Hill Business Park, which is the S line, and finally the Waterdown Commercial Center is the L line. So these are the greatest opportunities that we have to grow ridership based on the growth that we're seeing in these particular areas that are outside the former city of Hamilton proper. So re-envisioning my HSR, which is our project that we undertook in 2017, was looking at how we were going to design a system that would best meet our customers' needs, our current customers, as well as looking at trying to design a system to allow for people to make transit that first choice. So that was the whole premise of coming to council with what the Re-Envision project is. I updated you on Transit Day as to where we are in the process, and I do have a few slides around that. So we went out, we conducted a survey with all our residents right across each ward, looking for existing customers and current customers, looking at existing and current customers, and as well as looking at people who aren't currently using transit, and are using that information to come up with what a recommendation would be for a design for transit. Again, keeping in mind that we want to increase ridership out there right across the city. Oops. And based on what we heard from current customers, what we heard from people who would use transit as a method of traveling to get them out of their car, is that they're looking for frequent and reliable service. That is a constant, not a requirement, but a constant theme that has always been prevalent for people. What they're looking for out of their transit is frequent and reliable service. So in regards to where we are with re-envision, so in the winter of 2019, we completed our survey, got almost 6,000 responses. It was a very robust survey that we're working with McMaster University on extrapolating all that information, and then working with them in regards to coming up with what a design for a system that would support the entire city and to grow transit and have that great base. Through the spring and summer of last year and the fall and winter, we've been doing our customer outreach. I've started our customer outreach based on the results of those surveys. And then in March of 2020 is the deadline for McMaster to come back to us with their report, with their recommendations on what that system looks like for to service Hamilton. And then we will be coming to council shortly thereafter with a report to share all those findings and what their recommendation is in regards to what that service design looks like. And then moving through the process, then after getting council support in regards to the design principles and what that new design looks like, then coming up with what the financial strategy is to fund that particular design for the service moving forward so that we can continue to increase ridership. Oh, sorry.
Is there any questions? I have a couple of questions on the... You wait till the end? Is everyone okay waiting till the end? Councillor Partridge, are you okay? You okay to wait? Yeah, okay.
I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you. Mike?
So through the chair, maybe I'll suggest, I'm going to be up here a while talking about area ratings, so I'm not sure if Debbie just wants to have a seat and then we can answer questions. Thanks, Debbie.
Thanks, Debbie.
So as I mentioned, two parts to my part of the presentation. First is a bit of a primer, just generally speaking to area rating, not specific to transit area rating. The second part, specific to transit area rating. So as I alluded to earlier, this afternoon, area rating is intended to account for either significant differentials in service levels or costs of providing services between different parts of the city. If a service is not provided in a specific area of the city, property owners in that area will not be taxed for that service. And finally, the result of area rating is that tax rates vary depending on the area of the city and the level of service offered by the city. And so I'll provide some finer details around transit and the transit tax rates that are determined by the service levels being provided and our area rating methodology. So we've referenced earlier today as area rating is prescribed through the Municipal Act in terms of how you area rate. And so the Municipal Act allows municipalities to area rate special services, which are defined as a service or activity by a municipality that is not being provided or undertaken generally throughout the municipality, or being provided or undertaken at different levels or in a different manner in different parts of the municipality. So those are some of the parameters that we have to work within as it relates to provincial legislation. And also, the Municipal Act prescribes that health programs and services as the only service that cannot be identified as a special service and area rated. So we are limited in not being able to to area rate health programs. A bit of historical context. Prior to amalgamation, the former region of Hamilton-Wentworth, so this is not necessarily new, the former region of Hamilton-Wentworth used to area rate some services, transit, in the case of the Wentworth Board, library services, waste management, and storm drainage were previously area rated prior to amalgamation. And over the last significant number of years, post-amalgamation, there's been different iterations of area rating over the years. Some services have been transitioned from area rated to general levy. Some services were added on to area rating, and for the benefit of Councillor Paul's or some of the newer councillors or citizens, is there's been considerable concerted effort by previous councils to review area rating. Previously, there was an area rating subcommittee convened to look at our area rating policies, practices, and different service levels. In 2009, staff prepared a recommendation report with options as it relates to area rating. At that same time, a citizen forum was convened, and they provided recommendations, and ultimately there were some amendments to area rating policies, practices. So the basic approach to the review of area rating reflects the following two outline principles, as been mentioned a number of times this afternoon, is area rating does not generate additional, or the elimination of area rating would not generate any additional dollars. Area rating is just the distribution of that financial burden. So eliminating area rating would be revenue neutral. It would just change the distribution of that financial burden. And also the principle that we should keep in mind is the tax policy shouldn't dictate the service levels. Is the tax policy should determine who pays and how we collect. But again, eliminating area rating or any tax policy should not inform the level of services we provide or the service methodology. Some additional principles, general principles. There may be key or significant differences in service levels and costs. And again, that's not determined by a user pay principle. It is more of a tax policy decision in terms of the distribution. And where appropriate, area rating identifies fairly distinct differences in service levels and costs between urban and rural. Not all properties within each boundary will have the exactly the same access or utility of service. So as an example, I think Councillor Whitehead was making reference to how we area rate in the former City of Hamilton. It's not by ward, it's by former City of Hamilton. So you could have different service levels within the former City of Hamilton, but they're all paying the same transit rate. And again, this has evolved since pre-amalgamation, post-amalgamation. We've had different iterations as it relates to area rating policies. Some services have transitioned off of area rating. We've changed how we area rate. We've gone from, in some cases, former municipality to urban rural, and so there have been different iterations in parts as the population's changed and as the utilization or access to services have changed, so too has our area rating policies. So again, as I've just mentioned, 2001 to 2010, area rating was principally based on former area municipality boundary, and since 2011 it has shifted to a urban-rural model with different boundaries. So for councillors, you'll be familiar with our area rating of fire has one specific boundary. As it relates to transit, there's a different boundary. How the transit boundary is defined, I'll speak to in the area rating of transit slides, but effectively it's determined by access to service. So in 2011, the city implemented again an urban-rural model that aligns to the transit service area, and properties within the transit service area are considered urban, and while properties outside the transit service area are considered rural. So again, it's an urban-rural model But again, within the urban, you'll see in the upcoming slides that within the urban model, it's determined by former municipalities. So the urban ring is further broken down by former municipalities. And you'll see that in the upcoming slides. So again, the blue area represents the transit urban, which also represents how we area rate for recreation, sidewalks, and street lighting. The yellow area is our rural area in the case of transit, recreation, sidewalks. They are not levied for transit. So again, the properties within the blue defined area are levied for transit. The properties within the yellow defined area are not levied for transit services. And then further, as it relates to the blue area, we further break it down by former municipalities. So within former municipalities, we set the tax rates according to the level of service, kilometers of service, and the kilometers of service determine cost, kilometers of service define the tax rates. So specific to transit area rating, it's based on the urban rural transit model aligned to the transit boundary. Properties outside the transit boundary do not pay for transit. We continue to tax rate according to the former area municipality share of total transit service mileage within the urban boundary. So again, within this blue area and according to the former municipal boundaries is properties within that blue area would pay for transit, and they would pay according to the kilometers of service being provided within those geographic boundaries of former municipalities. And again, the total levy for transit area rating excludes the budgets for ATS or DARTS contract and taxi script, but it does include the capital financing costs for conventional transit. So as it relates to, and I believe this represents 2019 numbers, I'll just turn to staff and confirm, yes. So according to, based on 2019 numbers, as it relates to the levy of transit, how transit is levied, you can see the splits across former municipalities. Again, this was part of the previous report. Hamilton represents about 82% of the allocation, and then working across Stony Creek's approximately 6.4%, Glanbrook 2.3%, Flamborough 2.5%, Dundas 2%, and Ancaster 4.5%. And again, that is determined principally by the kilometers of service in the former municipalities, excluding the properties outside, obviously, of the transit boundary. You can see what the corresponding dollar value of these percentages represent. The next line represents just the total assessment base within that urban boundary of those former municipalities. And the fourth line represents what the transit tax rate is by former municipalities. So again, urban, rural, but within the urban area is we area rate it by former municipality and levels or kilometers of service by former municipality. And so that's what determines the tax rates by former municipality. And the dollar values, again, what we've done is try to set some sense as to what that represents using the citywide assessment average of $358,600. But if you apply the tax rate against that average value, that's how you arrive at these dollar values. And so again, it's an average using the citywide average. The second average is if we actually use the average assessed value of each of those former municipalities, that's what determines the value. So again, if I look at Ancaster, the fact that the second value is greater than the first value tells me that the average assessed value in Ancaster is greater than the citywide average of 358. So again, we have the specific numbers by former municipality, and I would say this is the value to focus on because it reflects what the average assessed value in the former municipalities are and using the tax rate. So with respect to options, you've heard reference to eliminating area rating. If we eliminate area rating, every property in the city of Hamilton would pay for transit. So urban, rural, there'd be no boundaries. It's everyone pays for transit. And again, rural areas of the city of Hamilton are currently exempt for transit, and so they would then be levied for transit. So what this option would represent in terms of tax shifts, so again, this is revenue neutral. Eliminating it doesn't generate any additional revenue. What it does is redistributes the cost, the tax burden of the service. So again, I'll highlight in terms of using the same color code. The yellow are the properties that are currently exempt. They're part of the rural district. If you eliminate area rating, now all properties pay. Those properties on average would incur an additional 6.6% levy increase, and you can see based on average assessed value that 6.6% represents a different value. Dollar value, Stony Creek could be additional $255, Glanbrook $252, Ancaster Rural $349, and Flamborough Rural $347. So again, the same percentage, but because average assessed values vary across those former municipalities, a different absolute dollar impact. And sorry, the final in this particular area that's captured outside of the transit boundary is 6.6%, $292. And this is where I'll identify the transit boundary, how the transit boundary is determined. It's all properties within 400 meters of a transit stop. So again, the boundary isn't an official plan boundary. Urban rural is you are considered urban if your home or property is within 400 meters of a transit bus stop. So as it relates to within the urban area, former municipalities, there would be a shift away from former city of Hamilton. They would receive tax relief of about 3% or $111. And that shift then would be absorbed within the former municipalities in the urban area. There'd be a shift of about 3.3% to urban Stony Creek, Ancaster 3.1%, Dundas 3.4%, and Flamborough 2.9%, and Glanbrook about 1.9%. And you can see what the corresponding dollar values are, somewhere in that range of $100 or $83 up to $183. That would be the shift. So again, revenue neutral. If now we eliminate area rating, all properties pay for transit, and the most significant shift would be on to the rural property owners because they're currently exempt. And again, the other outcome would be City of Hamilton would see relief, and the properties in the former suburban municipalities would incur some additional burden or cost. So the second option would be if it was a bit of a hybrid model, if 50% of the transit budget was general levy, so the previous example, 50% on general levy and 50% on the status quo, which is kilometers of service provided. So again, rural areas will continue to pay under this option, but they would pay effectively 50% of what they would pay under option one. So again, you'll see, generally speaking, it's about half of the impact to the rural areas as a percentage and dollar impact. And also correspondingly, you'll see Hamilton's would receive, former city of Hamilton would receive benefit from a reduction in burden of about 1.5% or $55 on average. And then there would be a offsetting impact to the suburban areas. Stony Creek 1.6%, Glanbrook 1%, Ancaster 1.6%, Dundas 1.7%, and Flamborough, Waterdam 1.5%. So again, that's a second option. It's a bit of a hybrid option. 50% would be general levy based on assessed values, and 50% under our status quo, which is kilometers of service. Option 3, an urban rural transit budget allocation model. So it assumes that the urban area city would be equally levied for transit service and use the same tax rates regardless of the level of service. So again, it's that urban rural, but rather than further breaking down the urban model by former municipalities, now anyone within that urban boundary would pay the same tax rate. And rural areas of the city would continue to be exempt. So under this model is Hamilton would see some relief. Former City of Hamilton property owners would see some relief of 2.4%, about $88. And you'll see a shift onto the urban. So again, a greater shift onto the former municipalities, urban property owners, because now the rural property owners aren't paying towards the transit service. So a shift of about 2.6% in Glanbrook up to about 4.1% in Dundas, and you can see what that represents in dollar terms for an average property in each one of those former municipalities. So again, 3 options. The first is the elimination area rating. The second is a hybrid of eliminating area rating, which would be the general levy and status quo. And the third option is going to an urban rural, so everyone in the urban area would be levied the same transit tax rate. Different than our current situation methodology, you can see that within the urban area, again, we further break that down according to levels of service, the kilometers of service by former municipality. So that would be the change. No longer further breaking down the urban by former municipality. So in terms of timelines, making sure I didn't miss any slides here. So as Debbie identified, is transit in cooperation with McMaster University and the community are in the midst of the re-envision. So just a reminder, the original motion was for staff to report back as part of the 2020 budget deliberations. Given that we are at the tail end of our 2020 budget deliberations, it would be aggressive to say that there's capacity or opportunity to affect our tax policies or rates. In fact, I would say that it's impossible for us at this stage of the 2020 budget to have the capacity as staff to be able to present this information, be prepared in the next month to inform our tax policies. Recognizing the fact that HSR is in the midst of the re-envision exercise, is re-envision May. I'm not presupposing the outcome of re-envision, but re-envision itself may result in a realignment of services according to within the City of Hamilton. So that alone may change the distribution of cost of service under the status quo. So that exercise alone could result in some shifting. What we are suggesting is to allow for that process and those results to come forward to council, and as council is deliberating on the re-envision and the opportunity to amend the current service delivery model, is finance staff can work in conjunction with transit as to what that would represent under the status quo, whether there would be any shifts, and beyond that, then we could start to develop some alternative options as it relates to area rating options. So you'll see, as it relates to the timelines, what we're suggesting is working with subcommittee in the fall of 2020 based on the outcome of re-envision and potentially incorporating some options, tax policy options around area rating to inform the 2021 budget deliberations. So I think that's the end. That is the end. There's not an end slide. That's the end of my presentation, and happy to answer any questions committee might have.
Thank you. You can work on that end slide later.
Yeah.
So I do have a number of questioners. I have Councillor Collins, Councillor Partridge, Councillor Clark, Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Mike, I was hoping to focus first on the 10-year transit strategy. So if I could ask you to take us back to part of Debbie's presentation, which is slide 4 that I'm interested in. And if I can put some of my questions into context off the start, I'm certainly cognizant of the fact that when we're dealing with tax policies, and we look at shifts, and we've witnessed this before in the past. We've seen shifts from commercial and industrial onto residential. We've seen the assessment shifts from the province through MPAC. So and we've also dealt with area rating and with other services in the past. And all of those issues have had impacts on certain geographic areas in the city. So I'm cognizant as we go through this that with whatever changes we make, there will be tax implications for people, and for a number of people, they'll see increases, and we'll start to then speak to the whole issue of affordability. So I'm asking my questions in that context, and I'd like to go through a couple of layers, if you would. So on this one in particular, one of the shortcomings of the 10-year transit plan, as I see it, and I've informally shared this with our transit staff, is that it doesn't give us a snapshot over the next, let's use the next 5 years now, of the transit enhancements that we're going to see. There's no master list that shows us these routes in this calendar year are going to be improved and enhanced, and as a result, these are the time differences that we'll see, these are the benefits that will accrue to our transit users and riders or prospective users. So I have no way of knowing through the next, the remaining years in our 10-year transit plan, and I fully anticipate council continuing to support it, at least this council. I have no way of knowing how we will continue to see incremental changes with some of the previous charts that we received in the first presentation. And so as a percentage of the lane kilometers that affect area rating, many of the new enhancements are located in the suburban areas. So by enhancing the system by default, we're seeing some of those charges just change because of the enhancements that have been made through the 10-year transit strategy. So I'm interested to know, through you, Mr. Chairman, is there a way for us to see the impacts and how the current ratios will change, leading us through the last number of years as part of the transit investment that we're going to make as part of the 10-year plan? So I hope I've properly explained that. I'm interested to see whatever shifts are just going to come organically because we're continuing to support the 10-year transit plan.
Yeah. So through the chair, I'll let Debbie start, and maybe I can add some context as well.
So through the chair to the councillor, I'll start off. I know that once we get our information back from McMaster and their recommendations in regards to a new design, incumbent in that will also be all the information that they've gathered around trip generators and where the greatest opportunity for growth is. So I anticipate that once we get that report back and all that information, that we should be able to draw some conclusions specifically around where we would be targeting investments to build on that new design. So it might not be 100%, this many hours on this particular route, but certainly focused on those areas where we have the greatest opportunity for ridership growth. So
Is there a way, and thanks for that, Debbie, is there a way through you, Mr. Chairman, to understand how the first, and I understand the first couple of years we're dealing with deficiencies, as is noted here, but I'm assuming we have 2 or 3 years now of enhancements that would give us some understanding in terms of how the ratio has changed, or has it essentially remained status quo because we're making equal investments in the urban area and in the suburban area?
So through the chair, specific to the last 2 years where we've really actually 2019 was probably the very first year that we really addressed growth. We relied on our APC data and our information and focused those investments specifically around the areas where we would see the greatest opportunity to grow ridership. So for instance, the service enhancements we focused on in September of 2019 were specifically on the Rymal route. At least a good portion of those hours were attributed to that. And then subsequent to that, we did see an increase in ridership numbers on Rymal. We also focused our investments on the A-line as well. and then some frequencies and the B line as well on the weekends. Again, addressing those areas where we had the greatest potential to grow ridership based on the information we had. So we certainly could give you a breakdown of what happened in 2019, and then of course we're embarking on the same strategy for 2020, providing council supports the year 5.
And do we know what that split is between urban and suburban? Is it a 40-60 split? Is it a 20% was in Upper Stony Creek and 80% was in Hamilton proper? You know, that's the kind of stuff I'm looking for, because that'll start to show us, I think, over the next 4 or 5 years, that organically, even with us doing nothing, we're going to see bigger investments in the suburban area just because we're investing in transit.
Yeah, and just for clarification, I think this might help as well. I asked the question when I met with Transit, when the 10-year plan is implemented, would there be, what would be the contrast in levels of services between the lower city and the mountain? Because that's always my pet peeve. And I always told you would close the gap, but it would still be there, the level of services.
Okay.
So I just want to highlight that as well.
All right, but let's deal with my question first. I have the floor.
Through the chair. So what we can tell you is where we have made investments. I'll use Rymel as an example. 61% of the kilometers attributed to every individual trip that we put on Rymel go to the suburban former municipalities. 24% of those go to Stony Creek and 37% go to Ancaster. When we put on service on the A line, 39% of the kilometers go to Glanbrook, 61% go to Hamilton. In Stony Creek, if and when we expand service out into Stony Creek, to the reaches of Winona, both north and south of the QEW, we know that 78% of the expansion kilometers will land with the former municipality of Stony Creek. Currently, 100% of the kilometers operated in Waterdown are attributed to Waterdown. We also know that through the remainder of the 10-year plan and getting to the implementation of the blast at a 10-minute frequency in peak, we're looking at a potential of 4 million new kilometers being introduced into the service. And again, as Debbie showed earlier, those those routes do touch into the former municipality. So there will be, as you suggested, I can't remember the word you used, but some fluidity.
There'll be a natural shift.
A natural shift.
Yeah. So for me to make a decision, an informed decision, I would like to see the last remaining years of the plan. How does that then impact the financing? So there'll be a shift. Suburban colleagues their constituents will just naturally end up, based on the model we have right now without any changes, will pay more. And I need to know what kind of shift. Is that something that's pretty dramatic and pronounced, and it changes those numbers, which are fairly lopsided in the previous information report, to something that's substantially different? Or is it essentially status quo? For as much as there are changes that will be made in the suburban area, we're going to see equal or more changes in the Hamilton area, and so maybe that number doesn't move. So in terms of getting back to that affordability issue, I would need someone to assist me in terms of giving a best guess, understanding that these things aren't in stone, as to how the current 10-year plan then affects transit. So can I just ask in a very general way, is that possible to have in front of the committee for a future meeting?
So through the chair, just for clarification, if I can ask, is that based on the current transit strategy exclusive of re-envision?
Correct.
So I'm turning to our transit colleagues to see whether or not how long it would take them to turn that information around.
So through the chair, it's certainly something we can prepare for the councillor.
Perfect. So let me then take you to the other layer, and that is the recommendations that are going to come from the task force. So we knew that if the LRT was to go forward, that there would be operational impacts. There was that whole discussion in terms of who pays under that scenario. That's now been canceled. I think one of the primary discussions that committee will have right now is probably bus rapid transit. There will be service implications there in terms of capital and operating costs. So is it possible, much like we've asked for a best guess on the 10-year transit plan and how that unfolds, Is there a way for us to wait? I mean, that decision's coming soon. That decision will then have implications from a budget perspective. For as much as the province is paying $1 billion, there's going to be a cost to Hamilton for operations. So I would like to know if we layer that decision, whatever it might be, is there a way for us to add that into the equation to see then what the implications are for Hamilton in the suburban communities? Is that possible to get once a recommendation is made? I'm assuming all the information's in hand. It's just a matter of then determining how that investment has unfolded over a period of time.
Yes, so through the chair, again, I'll turn to transit colleagues, I just don't know how much effort would be involved in understanding what those investments would mean and how they would drive some realignment of our conventional transit system. So just trying to manage expectations and timing is, given that they're in the midst of the re-envision, is just again, just wanting to ensure that we set some reasonable timelines or as it relates to reporting back with that information.
So through the chair, so we certainly could get that information, Councillor, but I am going to throw out the timing around. You know, we are at the end of February. We're getting our report back from McMaster at the end of March, and then coming to council in June with what that is. You know, I might suggest it may serve us to wait until that comes back, and then we could draw and get the information based on that new design, provided, you know, council supportive of what they're recommending moving forward. Yeah. Or if the councillor would still like us to just do it with our existing system, I'm happy to do that as well.
Well, I'd like to deal with the information as it's made available. So we're not doing anything in time for 2021. So right, for the 2020 year, right? So we have essentially a calendar year to gather this information and have some understanding in terms of the implications of how those dominoes fall once those decisions are made. So if they come out with their recommendation next month, and let's say that it takes a couple of months for the province to give it their blessing or not, when they make their recommendation, you know, we'll be in a position then to understand. Obviously, it'll be one of the first questions from council will be, if they provided this money tomorrow, how are we operationally going to deal with it? And one of the key questions associated with that is, what's the cost? So it's another layer on top of the other layers that I just talked about. And my problem in looking at these in isolation in terms of, well, let's change the shift, there are so many variables associated with the tax policy that each one of them has a different implication for people in the city depending on where you live. So I need to know the answer to that question. And so again, I don't need it in a month, I don't need it in 2 months, but I would hope to have whatever the implications are in time for whatever report that staff are going to prepare for 2020, 2021.
So through the chair, the opportunity may be, if the direction is to incorporate the outputs or outcomes of the task force as it relates to our timeline, we can add that and to try to determine the appropriate time to incorporate that through future updates to the subcommittee. And I'll add another variable. Councillor Collins may reference there's many variables out there.
Well, I have 2 more on my list.
So we discussed earlier this week our application to senior levels of government, which really is a driving force behind our transit strategy. That's a bit of an unknown as well.
Right. The other one I want to raise is this is the last year of assessment. So the MPAC will now go through another assessment round. We will receive new numbers that will impact everybody in this city. There will be, again, as we've been through it now since the early 2000s, there will be winners in that process and losers from a who pays perspective. And I would hope that at some point in time, and I don't know when that, my question was, when will that information be made available? Is it something that comes after your report that would be on the verge of the 2021 budget process? Or, so what's the timing in that?
So through the chair, just a point of clarification, it's not the last year of assessment. This is the last year of the 4-year reassessment period.
Correct.
So just in case any listeners are out there hopeful that it's the last year of assessment, it's not it's the last year of a 4-year phase-in.
Correct.
So the next phase-in is for the next 4-year phase-in would be 2021.
Yes.
And I believe it's because MPAC is trying to get ahead of appeals I believe it was based on December 2019 valuations, and I'll turn to staff. I don't know if not, we can get the information as to when those valuations are coming forward. I'm thinking the summer of this year that Gloria may know.
Yeah, so through the chair, preliminary would be available in the late third quarter.
Of this year? Of this year.
Perfect. So that seems to gel fairly well with whatever your report's going to come back. I would like that included as well. And finally, it's always a best guess in terms of the tax rate, which is the biggest common denominator between all of us. We have a very left of center council. I don't say that as a critique. It's just an observation. There's less of a desire, I think, this term of council to get as close to inflationary costs as possible. So one of the concerns that I would have is we were 2.5 out of the gate last year. We're looking at 2.9 or a little under 2.9 for this year. Those are numbers that are at least a full percentage point higher than the average for the last 10 years of this council. So we've hovered around 2% successfully for a decade. I can tell just from where there's less pressure to bring that number down. So I say that in the context of when you come back with the report later this year, I would like to know where we're at, and I know that number always comes down some, but I could guess in terms of where we're going to end up for 2021. I would like the assessment numbers. I would like the 10-year transit numbers. I would like the numbers associated with the other one that I mentioned in terms of the transit plan impacts. So I would like to see all of those impacts for every municipality and consolidated into one report. I think if we look at it in isolation, we have no idea then what the true impact will be on the tax bill unless you're looking at all of those at the same time. We can look at them individually and say, case closed, we've done our job and that's great, we've changed our policy, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to look at all of them at the same time. So whatever you can do to assist in giving us that information, I think an informed committee will certainly come up with a better conclusion than if we look at these on their own at different committees at different times of the year and then find out when the tax bills go out at this time next year, oh my God, X community is hit with whatever percentage increase. So I'm cognizant that, my former Hamilton is probably going to benefit more than others, but I have a Stony Creek community that I need to be concerned about. And obviously, if it was damn the torpedoes, I'd just be moving ahead today with one of the options that benefited the greatest part of my ward. I'm cognizant of my colleagues' position on this in terms of the costs that will come their way. So I can't make a decision unless I have all that information in front of me. So I'm sorry for going on. I'm 17 minutes, but I wanted to get all of that on the table. Sounds like you can accomplish most, if not all of that, and I appreciate you answering my questions. Yeah.
Councillor, if it weren't good questions, you wouldn't have had 17 minutes. Councillor Judy Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Mike, thanks for the information, and Debbie as well. It really is very helpful. If you could go to slide number 2. On this original motion on item D, that staff be directed to review the possibility of the area rating net benefit to wards 1 to 8 being used for public transit citywide and report to the Transit Area Rating Review Subcommittee. I don't see that included anywhere in this presentation.
Yeah. So through the chair, I think there's some confusion around the intent of that part of the motion. And so again, I alluded to looking for some clarification as to direction. If the intent of that was opportunities to invest additional resources into transit in areas wards 1 through 8, I would say that's not necessarily a tax policy discussion. That's more of a budgetary discussion. So if committee and council is looking to increase service levels into wards 1 through 8, that's not necessarily a tax policy discussion. That should be led by a budgetary discussion.
Well, I can't speak for the others on council, Chair, but certainly for myself, my expectation was that with staff being directed to review the possibility, et cetera, is that the money that is the benefit towards 1 to 8 would be looked at and reviewed as how it could fit within the options that are being presented here, if indeed they could. I mean, that would be my expectation. So when I say I don't see them, Chair, reflected in this presentation, they're on slide number 2, but not anywhere throughout the rest of the presentation. And that, so I was just a little concerned about that, I guess, or curious.
So through the chair, if the intent of that part of the motion was the options to claw back the savings and reinvest it is, that's an opportunity as it relates to a tax policy. If it is to claw back and reinvest it into transit, I would say the appropriate conversation is discuss what those reinvestments are, and because effectively that's area rating. So to be a little clearer, I think what you heard earlier this afternoon is the suggestion, let's eliminate area rating, let's reinvest those potential savings back into former City of Hamilton Transit. I would say that in order to do that, you would eliminate area rating. So if you introduce these shifts, and then you would reintroduce area rating, because the only way to justify reinvesting these dollars in the former City of Hamilton is you would have to have a higher level of service in the City of Hamilton to justify a different tax rate. So the only way to do so is two parts. You eliminate area rating, resulting in these shifts, and then you would reintroduce area rating in the former City of Hamilton and reintroduce those dollars into a higher level of transit service in the former City of Hamilton.
So I appreciate that explanation. I was just looking for a slide that would speak specifically to that, understanding that we, obviously we're looking at area rating, and these are area rating dollars, so I get that. But my next question, if you could go to slide number 7, please. There it is. Okay, so the existing transit activity centers. So at the bottom where it says the Waterdown Commercial Center, I just want to make sure that folks understand that where it says there is a link to the BLAST network, to these locations, Waterdown Commercial Center does not have a link to Hamilton or to BLAST. So I'm a little concerned that the slide indicates that and may be misunderstood. And I think it Chair, goes to the comment that was made. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name. Steve.
Jason.
Jason, thank you. So Jason made the comment that 100% of all the rides in Waterdown, their destination is Waterdown. Well, and that is because there is no link to anywhere else. You can't go anywhere else, thank you. So, but I have heard people say, well, I'm not sure what your issue is because they can ride down to Hamilton anytime they want. They can't. There is no direct link. So I just wanted to, Chair, I just wanted to point that out. My question on slide number 25, please. So on slide number 25, where it talks about the average 1 is based on the citywide average assessment, that's something that bothers me on every presentation we do where it says that, because that average is not reflecting many areas of our city. So I just want to make sure, my question is average number 2 the accurate number that is based on the average assessment of the former municipality? Is that broken down by ward? How is that figured in?
Yeah, so through the chair, average 2 is the more appropriate reflection as to what the experience would be by former, average in the former municipality. So not by ward, we do have that information, we can provide that information, but for the purposes of this afternoon to keep the slide less busy, is we're providing you what the average would be by former municipality.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me, and my last question, this would be, I believe it's on 31, the one right after 30 that doesn't have a number on it here. Yeah, thank you. So again, with this option here as the urban-rural split, looking at the figures, again, they're based on the assessed value of each ward. Is that correct? So when we look at Waterdown, sorry, and 3.6% is looking at $198, right?
Yeah.
That's,
So through the chair is I appreciate the councillor's focus so that would probably be reflective of your ward, councillor, but in the other cases, it's by former municipality and the urban boundary. So again, in these areas, it wouldn't be ward, it'd be former municipality. But I appreciate the uniqueness of Waterdown.
Yes.
Is that would be more reflective of your ward.
okay, thank you. And I just wanted to clarify that because essentially very little changed in my ward boundary when they did have the ward boundary review. Those are my questions. Thank you.
And
Thank
through
you,
the chair, I
Councillor.
just want to highlight, this illustrates what Councillor Partridge was speaking to, Waterdown being a loop. You can see that it's a bit of an island on its own, just in this graphic. So this is a way of illustrating the level of service and the lack of connectiveness.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. It's a loop, although we are having a transit roundtable next week, I believe, with many of the businesses located, certainly the newer ones coming in, looking at how we can expand that loop at this point just into the industrial area, which is not that, it's really right beside the commercial area currently being served. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I may, because I want to make sure that I'm understanding it correctly and by extension, the rest of the community who may or may not be watching. So area rating policies are really our tax policy, and it shifts taxes from one area to another area depending on the level of service.
Yeah, so through the chair, and I would just, a little wordsmithing,
That's okay.
It's not necessarily a shift, it reflects the different levels of service and associated costs. So it's not meant to be a redistribution of costs. Area ratings intended to reflect where there are different levels of service or cost of service is effectively capturing that through the different tax rates. So it's not intended to create a shift, it's intended to reflect the different levels of service or cost of service.
Thank you for that clarification. And so when I'm looking at Ward 9, which is a 1.25 annual boardings, if we now make a modification to that tax policy of area rating, and we go to everyone's paying, the general levy area here, so we're seeing in Stony Creek, the rural area, a $255 increase per home. And in the urban area, a $141 increase per home, give or take a bit, obviously, because it's depending on the assessment, with no change in service.
Yeah, so through the chair, that's correct. And it's important to note the principal area rating doesn't determine service or level of service. It just represents who bears the cost of providing that service. So under any of these three or other options, it is not going to dictate or determine the service level. It is essentially how you pay for the service.
And so then the other two options, the one that's 50-50, it shows, I think it was 128 in the rural area and 71 in the urban split. And then if we went to a rural-urban split, the rural area pays nothing because they're not going to, they're not getting the service, so they're not paying, period. And the urban split would be $170. So, assuming that area rating stays, regardless of what mode it moves to, but it's some type of area rating, as we make improvements to service in Ward 9, are not those improvements to service in Ward 9 thereby area rated?
Yeah. So through the chair,
In the urban area?
Yeah, if I understand the question is, under the status quo, if there are improvements to service in Ward 9, is it going to be captured in the cost? Yes. I think the question will be based on what transit staff report back as it relates to the balance of the 10-year strategy. As was highlighted in the 10-year strategy table, you'll see in the early years, the focus was on deficiencies, and those deficiencies, those pass-bys, were principally in the former city of Hamilton. So we didn't see the shift of burden to the suburban areas because the additional service investments were made in the former city of Hamilton. If in these latter years, there's more of a focus on the suburban areas, that will cause some shift. I just want to caution committee, not knowing what transit will report back in terms of those shifts. Density is a principal factor as well. And so in the suburban areas, given current density and even forecast, it will likely not move that split, that 80-20% split to a 50-50, because it will be density and demand that in part will determine how transit grows the service. And so over time it may, but within this 10-year time period, I'm not sure how significant of a shift, even under status quo, recognizing if the levels of service are made into the suburban areas, there will be some shift.
So over the last, Mr. Chairman, 12 years, there have been service improvements to Upper Stony Creek. When I first was elected, Councillor Jackson worked with me to increase service on the number 43. So we didn't have weekend service initially. Now we have weekend service. Upper Kenilworth came into the ward, which we didn't have when I was first elected. And the Rymal and Centennial was added. It's a new line completely. So were those costs area rated to Ward 9 urban area?
So through you, through the chair, they would have been area rated to the former municipality of Stony Creek.
Yes.
Not Ward 9. It would have been to the
forgive me,
former
not
municipality.
to Ward 9, but
Yeah.
to the former area of Stony Creek.
So again, based on kilometers of service. So the kilometers that are would have benefited the former city of Stony Creek, they would have been apportioned those kilometers and associated costs. And then if that service stretches into other other municipalities, they would have borne those costs. Yeah.
So the argument that I've heard from some of my colleagues around the table and some folks in the community is that the urban area of Hamilton was paying for these improvements to the former municipality of Stony Creek. In fact, if we're adding changes to it, to the former municipality of Stony Creek, it's area rated to those residents because it's an increase in kilometers of service to that area. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah. Through the chair, yes.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can an urban-rural area rating be phased in over 10 years?
So through the chair, there's no restrictions in terms of a phase-in. The last time we did our phase-in, I believe it was a 4-year phase-in. Staff are confirming that. It was a 4-year phase-in. So again, that's a local council decision as it relates to a phase-in period.
And I only have 2 more questions. I'm sorry to belabor this. So if we eliminate area rating, carte blanche, it's done. And there are now savings to the former municipality of, thank you, that's the one. So a decrease of approximately 3% or savings of $111 per year for the former citizen or city of Hamilton. Can they then turn around and say, well, but we're not really going to pass on that $111 per household. We're going to keep that $111 per household and we're going to improve transit? Because that kind of looks like area rating to me.
Yeah, so through the chair, that's correct. And I would describe it in 2 steps. And the first step would be this. If the intent is let's eliminate area rating, these would be the shifts. If the other intent was claw back the 3% or about $111 per household and reinvest that in transit, if that is being clawed back from former City of Hamilton properties, that level of service needs to be reinvested in former City of Hamilton, within the former City of Hamilton boundary. So effectively, what you're doing is reinstating area rating, but you would be reinstating where there would be a former City of Hamilton transit rate, which would be much higher than the rest of the City of Hamilton. So all of this, all of this boundary would have one transit tax rate, and this boundary, former City of Hamilton, would have a higher transit tax rate reflecting the additional transit service that's being provided to them.
Okay. Could the former City of Hamilton, the wards 1 through 8, claw back that money and use it for other purposes other than transit?
So through the chair, we did do that in the case of capital reinvestment. So we created the about $13 million reserve for former wards 1 through 8, and now extends in part to 9 and 14. So that those were reinvested according to our policy. Principally, it was intended for infrastructure or capital reinvestment.
But that was really just a 0.5 to 1% shift.
Yeah.
This is a 3% shift.
Yeah, so through the chair, if I recall, back in 2009, it was a lesser magnitude than what this would represent.
Okay, and so then the last question, so when we're talking to Councillor Collins' question, I think he asked some really brilliant questions, and I'm looking forward to get the information. If we're looking at the 10-year transit plan and we're looking at the task force and they're looking at possible rapid transit, the bus rapid transit, thank you, Councillor Ferguson. One of those is the Rymel line. Rymel Road is a 2-lane road for most of Rymel Road. So then how would we then begin to adjust for that when, in order to put in the blast network on Rymel, where the road infrastructure is not there to do it? And would that road infrastructure then be a part of transit, or would that be separate? You see my question? In Upper Stony Creek, we're moving to widen it to the 5 lanes, and we're slowly doing it, phasing it in, but that's a long road.
So through the chair, I'm not sure, I think the councillor's comment or question is the servicing in place in order to facilitate that expansion or that level of service?
You paraphrased very well, thank you.
So through the chair, as Debbie mentioned before, by the end of the 10-year strategy, the S line in your example is supposed to be introduced as express over local. It doesn't require significant infrastructure changes. That requires a bus operating at a higher level frequency and not stopping at as many stops. It's the same thing that we currently have on the A line. It's the same thing we currently have on the B line. Those are both express running over top of local.
Yeah, the challenge on Rymel though is it's a 1-lane, so it ain't running express no matter how you're doing it during rush hour. Just, you don't have to respond, it's rhetorical. Okay, so I'm interested in getting, thank you for the information, because there's been a lot of, and I don't want to disparage anyone, but I think the tax policy and tax legislation with regards to area rating is incredibly confusing and complicated. And for some people, they perhaps thought it could do things that it could not do, and that includes some of our colleagues around the table. So I think we've fleshed out some of that, and hopefully we can share that information with our colleagues in the broader community as we move forward. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and I think it's my wish, and I'm sure Esther Paul's wish, that we do get that 4 or 5 lane extension from Ward 8 all the way out to Centennial at the very least in the 10-year plan. Have Councillor for Lloyd Ferguson. Sorry, Lloyd.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm impressed by the debate here so far. I think that everybody's been sympathetic to what could happen to some of us, and clearly with what Mike laid out, there'd be some pretty significant winners and losers. And I don't think that was our intent when we started out, but you never know the will of other members of council. But I'm hearing on the other side of the table that there's some interest in that. I think Shad asked some amazingly good questions. We got a lot of things we got to throw in the wash machine, run it through the rinse cycle, and see how it all comes together. I don't know how we'll ever have this done by December 2020 if we're going to wait for the task force to tell us whether it's bus or LRT or bus rapid transit, because they're going to take up to a year to finalize that. But be that as it may, we'll keep plugging away at it. But just through one question to Mike. Mike, assuming is there going to be big winners and losers, and the majority of council is determined to eliminate area rating. Well, do we eliminate all area rating then? And if we do, that the capital part of the area rating, do we now, similar to transit, divide it evenly over 15 wards instead of over 8 wards? Is that something we can do and get a feel who the winners and losers are there, and then put it in that rinse cycle and see how it all balances out?
So through the chair, I think I heard two questions, so two answers. Does council have the discretion as to which services continue to be area rated or not? Is yes, so you don't necessarily have to eliminate all area rating. Fire can continue to be area rated, sidewalks, street lighting, recreation, they can continue to be
The
area
two
rated.
big ones right now is transit and the capital.
And fire as well is a significant. So if I understand the councillor's second question with respect to the $13 million in capital reinvestment, that because that is levied against former City of Hamilton properties, that benefit accrues to former City of Hamilton wards and their corresponding proportion of recognizing now it captures part of 9 and part of 14. So again, you benefit according to what you are taxed. And that 13 million is taxed against the former City of Hamilton, and for that reason, it benefits the former City of Hamilton property owners.
Okay, that's all my questions.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Esther to take the chair. Mine are two really quick questions, maybe three, depending on the answer. So the first one is, in 2001, after amalgamation, and I believe it was in 2001 or 2002, to appease because of the challenges with the forced marriage on the transit. As I understand it, when it was regional, so I want to make it clear that transit was always regional. It wasn't city, it was regional. And so for some reason, we tinkered with the formula after amalgamation when we could have just maintained the regional formula that seemed everyone was okay with. What was that regional formula?
So through the chair, unfortunately, my institutional knowledge is limited to 2001 when I joined the city, so I don't know what whether it was based on assessment or whether it was option 2. It might have been option 2. That's before you today, 50% kilometers, 50% assessed value.
Well, that was my understanding. 50% assessment.
So Brian has 35 years of institutional knowledge and.
Okay. Brian?
So we won't go back that far, but yes, well, through the chair, that is our understanding. But we could try to look back and see how that was done if that's that question. But I think it sort of covers off one of the options up here.
Yeah. So again, through the chair, I believe it's option 2. It's the hybrid of the general levy and the kilometers.
Well, the reason I'm asking it because it's my understanding that in the regional days, it got support. It didn't tear communities apart. And then for some reason, well, I don't blame the outlying areas. They were forced into a marriage, and so everything became a prickly point in the context of taxes and services. But I want to make it clear that contextually, the actual formula for regional transit was always option 2 that's up there now. Is that correct? Would I be safe saying that?
Yeah. So through the chair, that's my understanding, and it's also my understanding that one of the driving forces to to moving off of this option to the kilometers was not only post-amalgamation, but reassessment. Reassessment represented some significant shifts
Yeah.
to the outlying areas, so that in part helped to mitigate some of those reassessment impacts.
So, and I appreciate it, because there was a perfect storm for the outlying areas in the context of the assessment and market value, and $80,000 homes all of a sudden becoming $500,000 homes for people that lived out in those outlying areas and got hit pretty significantly on their taxes as a result of those changes. And so I can understand and appreciate the decision that was made, but that was because of those tax shifts then. Now this is now, and the question is it palatable or not? And it's certainly something I want to flesh out more. But my challenge is, and I think these are legitimate points that have been raised by both Councillor Collins and Councillor Ferguson and Councillor Clark and Councillor Partridge. Everyone has actually raised it. Because I met with Transit and I asked at the end of the 10-year plan, I don't care about what's being invested today or tomorrow or whatever. What I want to know is what it looks like 10 years when all those investments are made. What would be would there be a contrast between different geographic areas and level of services? And I was told, like, would the gap be closed, for example, with the service in the lower city? And I was told virtually no. We would get greater services, but it's not like they're going to abandon the lower city in regards to investments in the next number of years as well. So it's like you're trying to catch a moving target. You might close the gap a little bit, but you're not going to close it completely. And so at the end of the day, you're still going to have that inequity. And that's what it is. When you have significant contrasts in levels of services, but you pay the same tax. And that's what I'm trying to avoid. So maybe the question I should be asking through Mike to Transit, because I may mischaracterize it, and if I did, I'm certainly giving you the opportunity to clarify. But I did ask that question, Debbie, and the answer was that it wouldn't be significantly different in the level of services after the 10-year plan.
Is that a question for Deb?
Yeah.
Debbie?
So through the chair, I'm trying to recall that conversation, Councillor. I'm not saying that it didn't happen. I just, I don't recall the conversation around what would the difference be after the 10-year.
So I'm going to give you the opportunity. I mean, the conversation took place, and you may or may not recall it, but so let's start fresh. And so I'll give you the benefit. And after the 10-year plan, because I've seen, and we've had the conversation, and there are investments in the lower city through that whole 10-year plan. Will there be a significant contrast in levels of services still existing between the balance of the city and the lower city?
Through the chair, I think the easiest way to answer that is for the last 2 years, we've invested over half of our, more than half of our investment in mountain routes. As you go through to development of the blast lines, the S line is on the mountain, the T line is on the mountain, the A line is on the mountain. Will there be significant investments in local routes on the mountain? Perhaps not, because we have almost across the board the same level of service at 15 minutes in peaks and 30 minutes in off-peak. There may be some opportunity on weekends, but I would say the outlier, if we get our the proposed expansion this fall, the outlier on the mountain will be the Route 43, which is still lingering well behind. And again, that will, based on the nature and the length of that route, will gobble up a lot of hours. So I would say you will continue to see well over half of the expansion hours being put into the mountain over the remainder of the 10-year plan.
So I guess my challenge is, like, and I mentioned Ward 8, 240 kilometer miles, and you extrapolate, and the lower city is much smaller in kilometer miles. So when you actually take a look at kilometer miles versus services, then you get a stark contrast. And so when you speak about the level of service on the mountain and the local service, you're really not addressing the percentage of kilometers of service in the mountain relative to how many miles there are, versus the percentage of services versus the kilometer miles within the lower city. And it's significantly different, significantly, in the context of what you need to serve, how spread out. You don't have the same densities on the mountain as you can appreciate, so you have a bigger challenge.
Yeah. Through the chair, I'm glad you brought that up. I wouldn't disagree with you. What I would say, just for a point of clarification today, I keep hearing about differing levels of service in the same vein as jurisdictional kilometers. An individual living in Ward 12, 14, 8, 7, 6, 9 on the Route 43 gets the exact same level of service. There is no difference in the level of service that that person receives. The difference is in the jurisdictional kilometers that are driven in those wards, which then contribute to the tax apportionment.
So
The same thing holds true on Route 44. There is no difference, save and except for weekends on Route 44, where we short turn every other bus going into Ancaster, so that the jurisdictional kilometers are not driven into Ancaster, and therefore they aren't getting charged the kilometers to go in there.
So when I deal with my daughter who's working at the Kentucky Fried Chicken on the A line and is waiting between 30 and 45 minutes after 9 o'clock on a Friday or Saturday, is that the same level of service we would have on a main line in Lower City?
So on that through the chair, on that particular route, it would be the exact same level of service. What you have the difference in level of services is how many routes are operating on the same corridor in particular areas of the city.
So you're saying that on Main Street on a Saturday evening, it goes up to a 35 or 45-minute wait at each bus station? Yeah, we don't have that on Upper James.
That's correct. What you had asked, through the chair, what you had asked is, does somebody who's on the A line get the same service on the mountain as they do in the Lower City? Yes, they do on that particular route. It's the exact same level of service. What the difference is how many routes you have driving on a corridor.
But it's not the same level of service for that bus, that transit user who's waiting. I mean, we had issues, and we still have issues with that service, but having said that, that teenager who's waiting at 11 o'clock at night after work has to wait much longer than the same person on Main Street. So I guess my concern is we're not at the same level of service, not even close, and that concerns me. Now, another example is Mohawk, the Mohawk line at evenings. When I got a senior that's working at at Lime Ridge Mall, we're talking probably 10-minute car drive, and she's trying to get into the in the neighborhood between West 5th and Gar Street, and she has to make an exchange at the Terry Berry Library, and it's an hour and a half for her to get home on a 10-minute car ride. Is that the same level of service we have downtown?
Through the chair, it's a very specific example on the mountain. I don't know that I can compare that to a very specific comparison downtown.
Okay, I'll give you another
I
one.
could say if somebody is standing at Barton and Lottridge and they need to get to Locke Street, they're probably taking exactly the same amount of time through our system right now, the way it's designed.
So I'm talking about a major employment center. I'm talking about Mohawk Road, which is a major artery on the mountain. And I'm talking about hooking up at Terry Berry Library where it constantly misses the exchange, meaning there's another 15, 20-minute wait that senior has to just to get home. So my point is, I could give you example about poor service on the mountain, and I don't hear the same complaints in the Lower City. And I read the Post, not even close. So I'm trying to understand when my son takes a bus to McMaster University, and he can get to Toronto faster. He can get to the Gar Street and sorry, not Gar Street. Yeah, Gar Street and Stone Church. So I'm trying to understand, and I don't hear those kind of complaints and those kind of lengths of time in the Lower City because, man, my kids take the bus when they're downtown and they have no problem getting to Stony Creek. They have no problem going from one end to or McMaster University or to the rec centers or whatever, Tiger Cat game. No issues. But they're pretty prevalent on the mountain. And I just gave you three. I can sit here all night and tell you about inferior services on the mountain, and when you come back and say, well, it's the same as Lower City, I don't even see that on a map, because you've got a very narrow corridor to deal with in the city, and you only have basically north-south and very little north-south, and you got east-west, when we don't really have a robust service east-west on the mountain. We don't. So, plus pass-bys. We talk about pass-bys on the mountain? We can start that conversation. So I'm trying to understand when you try to defend the level of service when it's not defendable. The reality is there's a stark contrast between the level of service in the Lower City and the mountain, period. Is that not correct, through the chair?
Through the chair, I just want to clarify that I'm not defending the level of service on the mountain, and I think that that's why we have our re-envision project right now, looking at the system as a whole, and if we're getting people where they need to go, when they need to go there in a frequent and reliable manner. I'm simply stating in the example that was put forth that we were talking about an individual route corridor, or in the case of the A line, there's 2 routes that run on there, and comparing it to something that may have 4 or 5 routes running on that corridor. Absolutely, there's more service where there's more routes running along that corridor. Depending on where you are on those routes, it may be different levels of service entirely. If you get farther west of McMaster University, where you have very high levels of service on the main corridor, it branches off into Dundas and Ancaster, so different levels of service there as well.
Well, I just want to highlight the fact that, one, there is a significant differential in services, and I understand the level, you talk about these other services, but I'm speaking from the experience of a transit user, because I've asked my daughter, and all her friends are currently taking the transit system, to send me notes on all the issues and concerns between lateness and earliness and efficiency, and I'm getting even a bigger picture of the challenges we have on the mountain now. I am really looking forward for the revision process, because I think that will correct a lot of those things. So through Debbie.
So through the chair, just to build on just a little bit at a higher level to what Jason was saying earlier, and exactly right, that is why we embarked on the re-envision project, for issues specific around what you were expressing, for different service levels, and predominantly more on the mountain. As we intensify or get more dense population, of course, the ability to and the opportunity to grow ridership will happen there. So those were the conversations, those were the feedback that we were getting from our customers, and it's actually come through with what we've gotten through our survey results as well. So certainly not to diminish the experiences that people may have had trying to maneuver through the city at various areas at various times, weekends, evenings. And that's why we are working as hard as we are with re-envision, to be able to address that and to be able to provide a service for our customers that will be a viable option instead of hopping in their car, or and getting them to where they want to go at a reasonable time, and not have to take that hour and a half for something that potentially should maybe take a lot less than that if we had the proper design of a system.
And I appreciate that, but I need to be forceful, because I have actual transit riders now informing me on a regular basis the shortfalls in the services on the mountain compared to Lower City, because they ride both. I guess the best way, though, and I've probably asked this question wrong, I mean, you probably already have the answers to your own surveys. So what are the lower transit experiences with passengers versus what you're hearing from the transit experiences from mountain residents?
Through the chair, and I think you may have missed one of our maybe transit day presentation, but certainly through the surveys, I think the top 4 or 5 routes with dissatisfaction were on the mountain.
So, I mean, that proves my point and the importance of ensuring that we create some equity in the expenditures of the dollars that we're putting forward. And I want to be clear, and I could be wrong, but we had 2 presentations. Is that not correct? Did we not have Debbie and then Michael, and we sent Debbie to her seat, and those questions I asked were appropriate because it was really about Debbie's presentation?
So through the chair, I just suggested that Debbie sit down so that she wasn't standing for my part of the presentation.
Yeah, so I just
That's great.
I just want to highlight that.
You finished,
Anyway,
Counselor?
I'll take the chair back.
Okay, thank you.
And I have Councillor Collins second time.
Just to wrap up, we have 9.1 in front of us, which is an information report. I think we've come to a pretty good conclusion today that we will deal with service enhancements through the re-envision process as well as the 10 years transit strategy, and that doesn't make a lot of sense from a tax policy perspective to undo area rating and then reinvent area rating. So do we need to give some direction to the clerk in terms of just taking no action, that the committee and staff take no action on item D, or how do we address that today so it's not back on the agenda as part of a future discussion?
So through the chair, the front end to that really is a introduction to the presentation. So as it relates to next steps, staff are suggesting these would represent the next steps. But over and above this is, I believe there were 4 specific requests, and I might be wrong. There may be some further additional requests for information from committee today. So we'll incorporate that into this timeline, including the task force, the outcomes and output coming out of the task force. So again, as it relates to some of the directions coming out of the subcommittee today, we'll incorporate that into this timeline, and we'll work with clerks and the chair as it relates to the appropriate next subcommittee meetings.
Right, but for the purposes of dealing with council direction that was referred to the subcommittee, it does suggest that we investigate the possibility of aerating net benefits towards 1 to 8. And I think we had a good discussion around that today, and I don't think there's an interest in terms of going down that path in light of the policies and the complexities that you provided in your answers, Mike. So from a procedural standpoint, do we suggest that we take no further action on that, or do we just leave it and it sits, and because no one raises it?
Receive it.
So we're in the hands of committee if the is to receive that information. And again, with respect to C, is what we're suggesting is to push out the, given where we are with respect to 2020, given the re-envision work, and that work will help inform area rating going forward as we would come back in the fall of 2020, subject to to all of these interim steps, and reconvene and discuss options that may inform the 2021 budget.
Okay, so I would move then to receive that portion and take no action.
So
and then-
moved.
then
Second by Council Clerk.
The other direction would be whatever Mike mentioned in terms of these timelines with some of the answers to the questions we've asked today.
Thank you. And Mike, could we put a date or time for first quarter, second quarter, third quarter? What would you suggest?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, so Council Clerk's covered it. So we move in a second. We need to have a vote on Councillor Collins' motion. I think it's an electronic vote. Oh, it's just received. That's right. Sorry, you're right. Yeah, so all those in favor? Carried. Okay, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's moved by myself and seconded by the chairman. This is an amendment to the Transit Area Review Subcommittee Terms of Reference. It's basically evaluating the options for rebalancing area rating for transit for 2021 budget process, including enhanced service levels that align the overall city transit strategy, and to incorporate them into the 2021 budget process. Should complete its recommendations by December of 2020. So this is just moving it out 12 months because of the time lags. And had we been another 30 minutes, the Stone Church bus on the mountain, I would have waited for an hour to catch it. Just saying.
There you go. Thank you. All those moved, seconded duly, all those in favor, and that would be a recorded vote. That succeeds. I need a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Partridge, seconded by Councillor Esther Pauls. All those in favor? Carried.